Ahai got kicked by his little sister straight into an otome game and became a vicious young master from a wealthy family. At first, all he wanted was to change his tragic ending. But what he never expected was that the male leads, who were supposed to be fighting over the heroine, all started clinging to him instead. And the heroine, who was supposed to end up with the male leads, spent every day getting close to the villainess instead. It all started on this day. He saw that his sister hadn't saved her game. He picked up the mouse, intending to help her. But before he knew it, he couldn't stop himself and finished the whole route. Realizing something was off, he suddenly had an idea and restarted the game, planning to keep playing until he reached his favorite scene, completely failing to notice the murderous glare behind him. As a result, while receiving his sister's fury, he got kicked right into the game. When he woke up again, he had already become one of the most insignificant characters in the game. At first, he thought this was just a lucid dream, so he lay back down under the covers. But then the maid who came in carrying tea let out an incredulous scream. "Young master, Mason is awake." Hearing that, Mason's parents rushed in at once. His mother hugged him tightly. "My baby, you've finally woken up." His father was so excited that he kept saying whatever Mason needed, he would have it prepared. Right after that, his older brother walked in too. But instead, he slapped him across the face. Seeing that, his father sternly shouted at him, asking what he was doing. It turned out this older brother had always looked down on him. Faced with their father's anger, the brother didn't seem to think he'd done anything wrong. Meanwhile, the stunned protagonist looked at everyone in the room and felt utterly speechless. "Damn it, who are you people?" The room instantly fell silent. The doctor concluded that he had amnesia. His father anxiously asked when he would recover. The doctor said it varied from person to person. In the worst case, he might never recover at all. A week later, the protagonist found that he had adapted to his new life much faster than expected. He discovered that he had transmigrated into the body of his family's youngest son. Because he was born late in his parents' lives, he was especially doted on. This family also seemed quite wealthy and successful. Not only that, but even the other nobles didn't look down on them, despite them only being a baron's household. He still couldn't believe that he was now the young master of a rich family. Still, a life where he didn't have to do anything and was served by a whole crowd of maids was honestly pretty great. That was until the day his eldest sister and second sister came home after hearing about his accident. As soon as Rosie appeared, it suddenly hit him. She was Moire, the villainous character from the game. In the game, she had originally been a central figure in high society and the most likely candidate to marry the crown prince. But everything changed once the heroine arrived at school. The heroine caught the crown prince's attention and eventually won his heart, and Rosie was immediately consumed by jealousy. Her envy and hatred turned her into a true villainess, and she used all kinds of cruel methods to bully the heroine. In the end, Rosie was sentenced to death. But behind it all, there had actually been a man manipulating her the whole time, pushing her to become more and more vicious. And that person was none other than Mason, Rosie's cousin, the very person the protagonist had now transmigrated into. In the game, he had originally been an unimportant minor noble with very little screen time, but relying on his family's power, he did many terrible things. After Rosie died, everything he had done was also exposed. All the victims came forward one after another to seek revenge, and in the end, they killed him together. The protagonist immediately felt that things were bad. He had to find a way to change his fate. Suddenly, his eldest sister asked whether he wanted to attend a masquerade ball at the palace with them. Hearing that, he wanted to refuse. But under his sister's pointed gaze, he had no choice but to agree. Rosie noticed that he seemed a little different today, and his eldest sister quickly explained that he had lost his memory because of the accident. They had originally wanted to keep it secret, but at this rate, the whole city would probably know soon enough. After hearing that, Rosie excitedly grabbed his hand and said she would do her best to help him recover his memories. Inside, he thought, thanks, but really no need. Back in his bedroom, he thought it over carefully. He had entered this role when the character was still young, so maybe there was some reason for that. And it also meant he could change the future. He felt that first of all, he absolutely could not get involved with any of the game's important characters. Then he had to find a way back to the real world. So for the upcoming ball, he absolutely could not attend. But things never go the way you want. On the day of the event, his second sister still dragged him to the ball. He truly wanted to cry, but had no tears. And worse, because his reputation was notoriously bad, his sisters had dressed him up as a girl. They said that the person you met at the masquerade ball would be your destined one. And sure enough, he still got entangled with the male leads here, while the villainess also met the heroine. He had transmigrated into the role of an insignificant, villainous young master. Originally, all he wanted was to change his miserable ending. But what he never expected was that the male leads, who should have been surrounding the heroine, all started clinging to him in strange ways instead. At first, in order to avoid getting involved with the game's main characters, he felt that the most important thing was absolutely not attending the palace masquerade ball. Who would have thought that in his eldest sister's eyes, his attempt to save himself just looked like he had become emotionally devastated from amnesia? And so his eldest sister forcibly hauled him out of the house. While his eldest and second sisters were choosing outfits, he had wanted to seize the chance to run away while Rosie wasn't paying attention, but he was unexpectedly drawn to a magic stone. At the same time, a man also pointed at that very stone and said he wanted it, although the protagonist hadn't even really wanted it himself. The man's gloomy expression inexplicably irritated him. Then, after the man glanced at him, his eyes suddenly lit up as if he had seen something astonishing. But for some reason, the protagonist felt like his heart was about to leap right out of his throat. He was so nervous that he nearly lost his footing. Luckily, Rosie caught him and said they had to hurry back. He quickly agreed and left with her. The feeling just now had made him think something bad was about to happen. After that interruption, he completely forgot his escape plan. Then, just as his eldest sister was about to drag him into the city center, he could only yank his hand free from Regina's grasp and say that even though he had lost his memory, he could still tell everyone was avoiding him. Even with a mask on, people would recognize him. Going there would only make him obnoxious in everyone's eyes. But his eldest sister truly was terrifying. She actually brought him to the ball dressed as a girl. The bustling crowd of ladies immediately recognized his eldest sister, second sister, and Rosie, and the nameless protagonist was shoved right out of the group. Women were honestly terrifying, but even more terrifying was the fact that he had thought nothing would happen if he wore that outfit. Completely beyond his expectations, he, a man, ended up being chased by a whole group of men. Meanwhile, in the palace, Crown Prince Carl was on his way to the ballroom after being reminded by a servant. By chance, he overheard the servants below whispering that, supposedly, at a masquerade ball, you would meet your destined other half. Not only the current emperor, but even the former emperor had met their beloveds at masquerade balls under the guidance of fate. Hearing that, Carl found it interesting and silently put on his own mask. And by sheer coincidence, love arrived around the corner. The protagonist ran straight into the Crown Prince's arms, and he didn't even realize that his mask had already fallen off. Instead of saying anything, he was worried the other person might be hurt. Then, when he heard the men chasing him from behind call out, he was so startled that he sprang up and bolted. He left the Crown Prince standing there looking baffled. Clearly, though, the Crown Prince hadn't recognized who he was either. Still, that fallen mask naturally stirred something in the Crown Prince's heart. A moment later, the protagonist ran into the forest and finally shook those people off. Looking at his reflection in the water, he had to admit that after dressing as a girl, even he himself was stunned by how beautiful he looked. He just hadn't expected it to be that dramatic. But before he had even been clear-headed for a full minute, another person suddenly appeared out of nowhere. At first, he thought it was one of the men who had been chasing him, but clearly this person wasn't one of them. Without saying anything, he sat down not far away from him. This made the protagonist quite irritated. Still, he felt as though the person before him looked oddly familiar. Yet no matter how long he thought about it, he couldn't remember who it was until the man suddenly spoke. "What? You don't recognize me anymore?" Looking at the way he was dressed now, he found it hard to believe. Could it really be someone who knew him? Frightened, he hurriedly turned his head away and said the man must have mistaken him for someone else. He had never seen him before. The man paused for a moment. "If you say you've never seen me, then I must have mistaken you for someone else." The protagonist only thought the man was strange until he noticed blood dripping onto the grass. Without even thinking, he grabbed the person who was about to leave. With that single look, the air instantly filled with the sickly sweet smell of romance. After staring blankly for a few seconds, the protagonist let go. Looking at the wound on the man's hand, he suddenly started encouraging him. I don't know why you got hurt, but if anyone wants to hurt you, then you should return it 100-fold. And wounds need to be treated quickly, too. Then he carefully gave the man some simple first aid. But the man's lips slowly curved upward. You really are a self-righteous meddler. As he spoke, he placed his own mask onto the protagonist's face. But at least in this, you're still the same as before. In fact, I should say you've only changed your appearance. Isn't that right, Miss Mason Jane Knox? A boy was kicked into an Otelm game by his little sister and became a vicious young master from a wealthy family. In order to change his tragic ending, he desperately tried to avoid the protagonists, but fate still brought him face to face with them at the ball. And the heroine, Uriel, who should have met the crown prince, the male lead, instead happened to meet Rosie, the villainess. And all because the protagonist fled in a panic, leaving his mask behind with the crown prince. When Carl returned to the ballroom with the mask in hand, his eldest sister immediately understood and quickly shoved Rosie right in front of the crown prince. The two exchanged a few simple greetings, and Rosie unexpectedly noticed that the mask in his hand belonged to Mason. Carl explained that he had accidentally knocked the mask off a lady earlier and asked whether Rosie knew who she was. Rosie couldn't exactly say outright that it was Mason, since his cross-dressing today was supposed to be a secret. So she hurriedly made up a lie, saying it belonged to a member of her family and that she was looking for her. When she heard Carl say he had met her behind the palace and seen her heading toward the forest, Rosie hesitated, unsure whether she should go. Only after Carl said it was fine and that the ball would wait for her did Rosie finally leave with peace of mind. But when she reached the forest, she didn't find Mason. Instead, she found the heroine Uriel hiding in a corner, secretly crying. The people who were meant to meet would always meet eventually. After Rosie patiently comforted her, Uriel blushed, embarrassed. Rosie gently eased her nerves and introduced herself. Uriel had actually heard her name a long time ago, but this was the first time she had ever seen her in person. Seeing that she looked much better now, Rosie asked why she had been hiding here all alone. Uriel stammered nervously, saying that because she had been sickly since childhood, she had never been allowed to leave home. As a result, aside from her maids, she didn't have a single friend. When she heard about this ball, she had been very happy. She wanted to make some friends here. But when she arrived and saw the bustling crowd, she got scared. So she ran here instead. As she spoke, tears welled up in the corners of her eyes. Actually, I know this kind of behavior is silly. Rosie gently wiped away the tears at the corners of her eyes and smiled as she encouraged her, saying that wasn't true at all. The fact that she had dared to challenge herself and do something she had never done before already made her very brave. And it was precisely that courage that had allowed them to meet. As she spoke, she asked Uriel, "So, would you like to be friends with me?" Warmth filled Uriel's eyes. I would. The boy had transmigrated into an insignificant villainous young master in a game. In order to change his tragic ending, he had done everything he could to stay away from the protagonists, but fate kept making him encounter the male leads anyway. And not only that, the male leads all ended up becoming interested in him. Looking at the mask on his face, the protagonist still couldn't remember who that man was, the one with jet black hair and those especially lonely violet eyes. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice. Someone inside was saying his name. His eldest and second sisters were both there. A noblewoman who looked down on a baronial family like his eldest and second sisters stood in the middle of the hall, loudly spreading rumors about the explosion outside the city. Supposedly, it had been caused by magical overload from Mason Jane Knox, the youngest son of the Knox family. Normally, a child's magical awakening happened around the ages of 8 to 10, but the protagonist, now 13, still had not awakened any magic. The woman mocked him, saying that a baronial heir with no magical ability like him was a disgrace among nobles. As he listened to her words, he suddenly felt as though something were pressing down on his chest so hard he couldn't breathe. In an instant, the original owner's buried memories all flooded into his mind. Because he had never awakened magic, he had often been mocked by children his age who called him useless. Out of resentment, he constantly got into fights with people. Over time, Even the adults found him distasteful and were just glad he wasn't their child. Even noble ladies, when chatting, would make sly jabs at his two sisters because of him. But he had never believed he couldn't do it. He only thought he was a little slower than others. Until one day, he personally overheard his family discussing whether they should tell him the truth, that he would never awaken magic. That sense of despair and betrayal made the original owner feel unbearable pain. The protagonist finally understood why the character later darkened little by little. At that moment in the hall, the eldest sister unceremoniously splashed red wine across the woman's body and warned her that if she dared gossip again, she would make her regret it. The second sister also stepped forward and reminded her that in order to borrow money, her own dear younger brother had mortgaged the entire estate. To this very baronial family she looked down on. If the debt wasn't repaid by the agreed deadline, then with interest added, her family's debt would become enormous. As she spoke, the second sister stepped forward and gave her a taste of her own medicine. No matter what, I still hope things improve a little for you. After all, I'd quite like to see you again in the future. Of course, that's assuming you can still keep your title. Meanwhile, Rosie and the heroine Uriel had just returned from the woods. When they heard servants searching everywhere for her, Rosie was very happy to have met her and hoped they would get another chance to see each other. Looking at Rosie, her first friend, Uriel, despite being frightened, still gathered her courage and asked whether Rosie could write letters to her in the future. Rosie hadn't expected someone so timid to take the initiative like that. She was delighted that she and Uriel could exchange secret letters. From now on, this would be their little secret. After watching Uriel leave, Rosie finally remembered she was supposed to be looking for Mason. When she turned back, she saw the protagonist walking alone in silence. Delighted, she hurried after him, asking where he had been. At the same time, his eldest and second sisters came out as well, urging them to hurry because the ball was about to begin. Rosie pulled the protagonist along toward the ballroom. Looking at his caring eldest and second sisters, as well as Rosie, he realized that the original Mason had always believed himself to be alone, when in truth he had been the one shutting himself off from everyone. The protagonist truly wished he could understand that. There had always been people by his side who loved him and whom he could rely on. A boy was kicked by his little sister into a game and became an insignificant villainous young master. Originally, he had only wanted to change his tragic ending, but he never imagined that the male leads, who were supposed to circle around the heroine, would all become attached to him instead. And the heroine, who was supposed to be with the male lead, ended up spending all her time around the villainess. After the masquerade ball ended, because it was said that the person you met there was your destined one, the eldest sister teasingly asked Rosie whether all she had noticed the whole night was the crown prince. Rosie blushed furiously and shook her head again and again. But if she had to talk about meeting someone, she really had met a new friend. At first glance, I thought she was a fairy. That person was incredibly cute, so pure and innocent. Seeing the bright smile on Rosie's face, the eldest sister turned to look at the protagonist, unable to hide the amusement in her eyes. Thinking of how Mason had been chased by a group of men, she said, "I'm guessing while you were running away, you had some fateful encounter too, didn't you?" The protagonist tightened his grip on the mask in his hand. Fate, but he knew perfectly well that he was in a game now. No matter how real it felt, that didn't count as fate. If anything, it felt more like a disastrous accident. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, the crown prince was holding his mask in his hand, wondering who that girl really was. And elsewhere, the baron's son kissed the bandage wrapped around his hand, murmuring his name under his breath. A few days after the ball, because his eldest and second sisters had both gone back to school, the protagonist could finally enjoy a quiet, leisurely life without anyone bothering him. But Dr. Felix came to interrupt that peace, asking whether he had remembered anything from the past. His heart skipped a beat. At the ball, he really had seen some of the original owner's unpleasant memories. It was true that he needed to figure out what was going on with this magic matter. So he straightforwardly admitted that he already knew he could not awaken magic. Felix was surprised. In truth, there was a reason he couldn't awaken magic. When he was little, he had actually been especially bright and lively, as innocent and cheerful as any other child. But when he was 6 years old, he suffered from a prolonged high fever. After he recovered, his magical power was gone along with it. Baron Knox had originally wanted to tell him once he reached the age when magic should manifest, but He had never found the right chance to bring up the subject. Even though he no longer had the ability to awaken magic, Felix told him he absolutely had to believe that his family had always loved him. They just didn't know how to express it. From what happened at the ball, the protagonist had already realized as much. He knew there were many people around him who loved him, but something still seemed off. It was as if only those with magic could enter the Magic Academy. So how had the original owner gotten in? At that point, Felix comforted him by explaining that even those who couldn't awaken magic could still use magic stones. Only then did he remember Rosie had also said that magic stones were useful things. People without magic could use them. Then everything made sense. The reason the original owner had been able to enter the Magic Academy was because he had used magic stones to cast spells and pretend that he could use magic. And since the game's plot began with enrollment, he suddenly had an idea. If he simply didn't go to school, wouldn't that let him escape his death ending? He couldn't help praising himself for being too smart. But then at that moment, an unwelcome guest, his older brother, walked in. It turned out he had deliberately come looking for Dr. Felix. Watching the two of them flaunt their closeness in front of him, the protagonist still found it hard to accept. Before leaving, his older brother sarcastically remarked that he belonged to the sort who lay in bed at home all day and didn't even know guests had come to see him. Damn it, how was that bad at expressing himself? He was obviously just a jerk. When he arrived at the reception room, he was wondering who it could be. All he wanted was not to get dragged into any trouble. But when he opened the door, the person inside was Rosie. As soon as she saw him come in, panic was written all over her face. That's right, what should I do? You have to help me. He had transmigrated into an insignificant villainous young master in a game. He had wanted to stay far away from the protagonist's battlefield and change his tragic fate. But without realizing it, he had already made two male leads who should have been revolving around the heroine start falling for him. What he never expected even more was that the Crown Prince had actually recognized him in women's clothing and launched a direct attack. At first, he had been planning that as long as he didn't go to school, he could avoid seeing the male leads again. But Rosie anxiously came to find him, hoping he would help her with something. Originally, Mason had hoped not to get involved in any trouble at all. But what he never expected was that Rosie wanted him to accompany her to the palace to meet the Crown Prince, all because after the masquerade ball, she had received an invitation for afternoon tea from His Highness. But she had never been alone with the Crown Prince before. She was afraid that, out of nervousness, she might say something improper. And the Crown Prince was the male lead of this game. Mason absolutely did not want to get involved with him. So he tried to find an indirect excuse to refuse, comforting Rosie by saying that since they were already engaged, even if she said something strange, the other party would probably just find her cute. But he didn't expect Rosie to explain that she and the Crown Prince were not actually engaged yet. Their families had only discussed it before, but nothing had been decided. Mason truly couldn't think of any other reason to refuse. Thankfully, Rosie sensed that Mason wanted to decline. After all, she knew very well that he had never liked this sort of occasion. So she forced a smile and stopped trying to pressure him. Originally, Mason let out a sigh of relief, thinking he had successfully stood firm. But looking at Rosie's crestfallen expression, he suddenly thought of his little sister back in the real world. She had always clung to him too, begging him to take her out to play. If he refused, she would burst into tears, and every time her little face cried itself red with grievance, he would eventually give in. Rosie was his cousin in this world, after all. He couldn't bear to see her so disappointed. Besides, he figured it was just a simple visit. Surely nothing would happen. However, on the day of the appointment, when he and Rosie arrived at the palace, although he looked calm and composed on the outside, inwardly he was panicking like crazy. That was because at breakfast, when his parents heard he was going to the palace, the two of them were struck dumb. Afterward, the whole residence was thrown into chaos, preparing him to enter the palace. And they repeatedly warned him not to cause any trouble again. He had already planned that once he got there, he would just find a quiet corner and stay there. But after entering the room, he still couldn't help glancing at His Highness the Crown Prince. That dazzling aura really did suit a male lead. But he didn't recognize that this was the very person whose arms he had crashed into that day. Rosie introduced him as the cousin she had mentioned in her earlier letter. The moment she said that, the Crown Prince's pupils visibly trembled. He recognized at a glance that Mason was the girl from the ball that day. But on the surface, he kept his composure. Then he walked over to Mason, extended his hand, and said, "I'm very pleased to meet you, Mason." Completely unaware of anything, Mason politely offered his hand in return. But in the next second, the other party suddenly yanked him hard, and before he could react, he stumbled straight into the Crown Prince's arms. Before Mason had recovered his senses, he heard the Crown Prince's voice by his ear. "How strange. I feel like I've seen you somewhere before." A boy was kicked into a game by his little sister and became an insignificant villainous young master. Yet somehow, he ended up making all the male leads, who were originally supposed to revolve around the heroine, start clinging to him instead. What was he supposed to do? Ever since the Masquerade Ball, the original story's first male lead, the Crown Prince, had found it astonishing when he first saw Mason, because Mason looked so much like the girl he had encountered that day. Excited, he couldn't help deliberately pulling him into his arms. "How strange. I feel like we've met somewhere before." Mason, meanwhile, had no idea that the person in front of him was the same one he had crashed into that day. Completely bewildered, he even thought the Crown Prince was deliberately teasing him. Pulling back his hand, he said that this was his first time meeting His Highness. A flicker of disappointment clearly passed through Carl's eyes. After apologizing, he had no choice but to let him go. Seeing that the Crown Prince didn't continue pressing the issue, Mason finally let out a sigh of relief, because he really did not want to have anything to do with the main characters. But what he never expected was that after he had only just sat down and exchanged a few words, the Crown Prince actually took out the mask he had lost that day. "All right, I just realized I seem to have forgotten to return the item your cousin dropped that day." Mason nearly gave himself away on the spot. He couldn't understand why his mask was with the Crown Prince. Thinking back, he had lost his mask only after colliding with someone that day. Suddenly, a horrifying realization appeared in his mind. The person he had bumped into that day was the Crown Prince. Realizing the situation was bad, Rosie quickly stepped in. "Thanks to your highness, I was able to find my cousin." Just then, Carl set down his teacup, as if recalling something. "Actually, the place where she knocked into me and fell still hurts a little even now. But I was really worried about her. She seemed to be trying to avoid something." Rosie, knowing full well that Mason had been cross-dressing that day, hurriedly changed the subject and asked what the title of the book the Crown Prince had mentioned liking before was. Carl seemed to think of something and gave a slightly mischievous smile. "Since we're on this topic, why don't we go to the library?" So before long, they arrived at the library. Left alone in the upper gallery, Mason let out a long breath. Finally, he didn't have to deal with him anymore. But when he thought again that the person he had crashed into was the Crown Prince, the future king, he couldn't stay calm. He could clearly feel that during their meeting just now, the Crown Prince had looked full of expectation when trying to get him to answer. He really wanted to avoid this subject, but he just couldn't figure out what on earth the Crown Prince was thinking. He truly regretted coming here. All this trouble had been brought upon himself. Lost in thought, he accidentally knocked over the stack of books beside him. One especially old book caught his attention. When he opened it, he found that it was a storybook. It was said that long ago, in a certain kingdom, there lived a very young and capable king. Although he was deeply loved by his people, he was very lonely. So his servants arranged a masquerade for their king, hoping he could find a companion. People from every social class would attend the ball wearing masks in search of their one true love. On the day of the ball, when he accidentally wandered to a moonlit lakeside shimmering with light, he met a mysterious being there. Their hair looked as though it had been woven from moonlight, and their eyes were so clear it seemed as if they could see through everything. Their body also radiated a mysterious energy. In fact, they were one of the gods of fate, a being who decided human destinies. Out of curiosity about why the human world glittered every night, they had come here. In the end, they fell in love with the king, but their happiness did not last long. The goddess's secret meetings with a human were discovered by her siblings. They were furious because gods of fate determined human destiny and were strictly forbidden from falling in love with them. Carl, who had been watching everything, suddenly asked Mason, "If the stone of destiny really exists, what would you ask of it?" The Crown Prince looked at him with a bright smile in his eyes. Mason was caught off guard for a moment. But if the stone of destiny really did exist, Mason lowered his eyes. "What I want most is to return to where I'm supposed to be." Hearing that, Carl reached out, wanting to ask what he meant. But he was interrupted by Rosie, who suddenly walked over, flusteredly explaining that she had gotten so absorbed in reading that she had lost track of time. Mason immediately strode toward her, leaving Carl standing there in stunned confusion. The hand hanging in midair slowly clenched. So when he saw Mason and Rosie off, Carl took the initiative and said that next time they met, they could call him by name. Between close friends, he believed there was no need to be so formal. Rosie was naturally delighted, but Mason flatly refused. The two of them stared at him in confusion. Mason firmly said that maybe Rosie could, but he came from a humble, noble family. He didn't think others would accept that, so he would be honored if they addressed him as the Empire's rising sun, rather than as His Highness's close friend. With that, he turned and got into the carriage. In truth, he simply didn't want any connection whatsoever with the Crown Prince. What he wanted most was to never see him again. After they left, Carl still couldn't hold it in and let out a laugh. He hadn't expected Mason to be that interesting, as wary as a little cat. He really wanted to know, if he approached him step by step, would Mason eventually open his heart? But at that very moment, someone else had been, watching everything from beginning to end. My dear little brother, every time I see you smile, I want to wipe that smile off your face all over again. That night, when Mason returned home, he stood on the balcony. There was already a clear hint of winter in the air. He felt a little melancholy. He had already been here for quite some time. He remembered that in the game, the Stone of Destiny had never appeared. Yet in this world, it existed in a single book. That meant this rare item must exist somewhere special. As long as he found it, he could return to his original world. So his next task was to find the Stone of Destiny. But as the days passed, this morning the entire estate was in chaos from the crack of dawn. The butler came into Mason's room with a headache, urging him to get up. Young master, I told you before, today is your 17th birthday. It's a very important day. As the butler yanked away the blanket covering him, the person before him was no longer a child, but the already youthful-looking Mason. After transmigrating into an Otome game, he had become an insignificant, vicious young master. Originally, he had only wanted to find the Stone of Destiny and return to the real world. But he never expected that the Crown Prince, who should have been circling around the heroine, would end up clinging to him instead. Ever since that afternoon tea 4 years ago, the Crown Prince would summon him to the palace from time to time. Even if he refused, the Crown Prince would personally come to the estate to see him. Because of that, the three of them, including Rosie, often met up. At the same time, he was also trying hard to find the Stone of Destiny. After all, once he found it, he could return to his original world. In order to find it, Mason bought a huge number of magic stones. But to his surprise, he discovered that he couldn't even use the most ordinary magic stone. Although, with the help of servants, he could sort the different kinds. In the end, all he got was a pile of magic stones he would never be able to use. Because of this, his father strictly forbade him from buying any more magic stones, so that he wouldn't continue wasting the family's money and manpower. Even though he secretly stashed some away, he still couldn't identify their types himself, making the search for the Stone of Destiny futile. And so the days passed. It had already been 4 years since Mason entered this game world. Today was his 17th birthday. After making the rounds, physically and mentally exhausted, he slipped out of the banquet hall. He knew very well that everyone attending the banquet had their own reasons. Celebrating his birthday was just an excuse. After all, who would celebrate the birthday of an ordinary baron's son, especially when he was famous for causing trouble? In fact, during the first year after he arrived here, when he turned 13, only his parents celebrated with him. The banquet had only become like this because of the Crown Prince. Back when he turned 13, he hadn't invited the Crown Prince, and Carl had been very angry. Ever since then, every year Mason had no choice but to send him an invitation out of courtesy. And every single time, the Crown Prince showed up. Over time, this little birthday banquet snowballed into the event it was now. Mason felt utterly drained. Not a single thing was going the way he wanted. He was honestly afraid he'd be trapped in this game until the day he died. Just as he was wallowing in his thoughts, the Crown Prince walked over and leaned in, concerned, wanting him to put down the wine in his hand. You're still underage. What if you get drunk? After all, you're always so careless. Mason sneered inwardly. I'm actually older than you, okay? He impatiently shoved Carl away. Adulthood is only a few months away. Please stop treating me like a child. Carl looked thoughtful, as if something had occurred to him. True, you won't be a minor for much longer. Then Carl suddenly realized Mason was now old enough to attend the academy. He immediately invited him enthusiastically to join the same academy he and Rosie attended. But Mason refused outright. He had no intention of studying there. After all, he couldn't get into the academy at all because he had no magic. Carl said, "But 4 years ago, didn't you experience a magic overload once?" Mason explained that it had been a misunderstanding. He had only happened to get caught up in that incident. He wasn't the one who caused the magic overload. Hearing that, Carl looked disappointed. He hadn't expected that even after being together for so long, there were still so many things about Mason he didn't know. But Mason thought there was no need to tell him about that at all. No need. Carl gave a cold laugh. "Mason, I thought we were already close. I'd tell you everything about me, if you wanted to know." Goosebumps crawled all over Mason's skin. Was it because he was the male lead? Annoyed, he pushed Carl away and said he had absolutely no interest in his affairs. He also solemnly asked him not to stand so close. Even so, Carl still noticed the redness at the tips of Mason's ears. So when Mason was about to leave, Carl suddenly pulled him into his arms without warning. Then, while Mason was still in shock, he turned him around and pressed close behind him. A necklace was then placed around his neck. "This is a gift I specially prepared for you. You must keep it with you." Mason's heart nearly leaped into his throat. Only after the crown prince left did Mason start stomping in anger. "You scared me to death. Didn't I say not to get so close to me? For 1 second there, I thought he was going to kiss me." From that moment on, Mason secretly resolved to stay on high alert around the crown prince. Meanwhile, in the banquet hall, two nobles were gossiping while flattering Rosie, saying she and the crown prince were a match made in heaven. Another noble told her that the upcoming exposition was a very popular place for dates. He'd heard there would be many rare foreign items there, most of which couldn't be found in the Empire. Rosie was somewhat tempted because Mason had always been with them, and she had never spent time alone with the crown prince. Maybe this time she could be a little more proactive. So when the crown prince had just come downstairs, Rosie shyly invited him to go to the exposition with her. Before the crown prince could respond, Mason, having finally calmed down, returned to the hall and saw Rosie earnestly trying to say something. Completely unaware of the situation, he stepped forward and asked with concern. When Rosie said there was an exposition soon and asked if he wanted to go too, Mason refused immediately. There would be too many people there, and he didn't like crowds. In truth, what he was thinking was that he couldn't keep staying around the two of them. That would be too dangerous for him. Unexpectedly, after thinking it over, the crown prince felt Mason had a point. It would be best for him to stay home, just in case. He couldn't conveniently reveal the details, but there was something very suspicious about this exposition. To avoid causing panic and chaos during the event, an investigation was currently being conducted in secret. After the banquet ended, Mason lay comfortably on his bed. At least another birthday had passed peacefully without any trouble. Then he heard a crow cawing outside the window. Ever since he'd transmigrated here, this little fellow had come unfailingly on each of his birthdays. Each time it left some mysterious gift. At first, it had only been wildflowers. The second year, he got the feet and claws of some demonic creature. After that, the gifts grew stranger with each passing year. Mason had even made some money by selling them off. Full of anticipation, he opened the gift box, only to discover that this time it was empty. Although he didn't know who the crow's owner was, he was certain that person had to be a weirdo. What he didn't know was that the person was secretly watching him, holding a magic-infused necklace identical to the one Mason was wearing. Who would have thought the second male lead was such a black-bellied type, so domineering when jealous? After seeing the crown prince give Mason a necklace and Mason actually wear it, he became jealous, took back the necklace he had originally intended to give Mason, and crushed it in a fit of anger. All that was left for Mason was an empty box, leaving him stunned. "Crow, your owner is definitely a weirdo." Unbeknownst to him, someone behind the scenes was watching his every move. The next day, when Mason came downstairs for breakfast, he learned from Regina that the recent exposition was unsafe. A group of illegal traffickers had been smuggled in. These criminals ran a rather large organization. By infiltrating other countries, they had built up an extensive network. In fact, they were already selling illegal goods to local nobles, as well as illegally poached demon creature cubs as collectibles. Even worse, they had also attacked other races and abducted beast folk to sell as slaves. So until the matter was resolved, it was best not to go out. And even if one had to, one should never go alone. Mason thought of what the crown prince had said yesterday. That was probably what he had been referring to. It seemed that everyone was telling him not to go, which only made him more curious. So that very day, he went to the exposition anyway. But besides curiosity, there was another important reason. Next year, when he came of age, Eric would inherit the position of family head. At that point, not only would Mason lose his allowance, he also had no magic and no skills, so no one would hire him. That was why he had come to the exposition, hoping to sell his magic stones. But he hadn't expected to run into Regina there. Left with no choice, he put on a robe to disguise himself. By the time he had sold the stones, it was already evening. Only then did he suddenly remember that he had forgotten to appraise the magic stone he had with him, the one the Crown Prince had given him. He had no idea how much it might be worth. Originally, he had planned to find a place to get it appraised on the way home. But instead, he noticed several suspicious-looking people. Realizing something was wrong, he thought he'd better leave at once. But the moment he turned around, a burly, fierce-looking man was already standing in front of him. Soon after, Mason was taken straight to their underground hideout. Because Mason had such a pretty face, they had originally intended to sell him at a high price for others' pleasure. But Mason spat right in the man's face. As a result, he got beaten badly along the way, and was then carelessly thrown into a cell. At the same time, back at the palace, the Knight Commander reported that they had found the traffickers' hideout. The Crown Prince immediately ordered them to make the safe rescue of the imprisoned beast folk, and the poached demon creatures their top priority. However, if they found any nobles mixed in with the criminals at the scene, and those nobles resisted or fought back, they could be killed on the spot. Mason shook himself awake and sat up. Only then did he notice that in the pitch-black cell, a pair of wolf-like eyes was staring at him. When he looked closer, it turned out to be a person. Just as he was worrying over the wounds all over the man's body, the man suddenly lunged at him like a beast. At that critical moment, Mason noticed a dagger Regina had given him. Luckily, he had brought it, as long as he could grab the hilt and cut the ropes binding his hands. But before he could, the man was already right in front of him. The man pinned him against the wall, leaving him unable to move. After staring intently at his face for a few seconds, he suddenly licked at Mason's neck. Then he bit down directly, and even after that, he greedily sucked at the blood that flowed out. Mason tried to kick him away, seizing the chance, but the man merely lifted his head and looked at him with a teasing expression. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the underground hideout, a figure in black was secretly searching through something. Hearing the traffickers' voices, he immediately hid. The traffickers dumped all the items taken from Mason onto the table, including the magic necklace the Crown Prince had given him. A little while later, one of them came in and casually said that the boy had probably already been torn apart by the beast man. After the men left, the man in black finally stepped out. Looking at the necklace on the table, his eyes filled with fury. So this was the second male lead. There he was, the second male lead, and upon seeing the male lead again, he immediately pushed him against the wall. At that moment, the man in front of Mason was still looking at him with bloodthirsty eyes, as if he wanted to devour him alive. There was only one thing Mason could do. He pulled out the dagger, intending to kill the man the moment he came close. Only then could he escape. But unexpectedly, the man suddenly collapsed unconscious onto him. By the time the man woke again, Mason had already freed himself and was crouching in the corner with the dagger raised defensively. After a while, seeing that the man seemed calmer than before, Mason finally relaxed and slumped to the ground. The man noticed the wound on Mason's neck. Then Mason suddenly heard an apologetic voice by his ear, startling him badly. The man explained that he hadn't been fully conscious earlier and was very sorry for hurting Mason. It turned out he was a werewolf, and because that day happened to be the night of the full moon, he had lost control. Originally, he and his people had lived happily in a remote village. Cedric's greatest dream was to protect the rest of his tribe and become the next chief. But his younger sister, Shay, felt that the bloodline of the wolf ancestors was no longer so strong now. She longed to see the outside world. Cedric still insisted that they could not mix with humans. After all, humans still saw werewolves like them as dangerous. And because they were a rare species, they were always at risk of being targeted by slave traders. That day, as usual, he had gone into the forest to clear his head. It was the farthest place he was ever allowed to go. But when he returned, the village had already been attacked. Hearing his sister cry for help, Cedric charged forward without thinking. not noticing that someone behind him had already seized the chance to strike him from behind. Although he eventually unleashed his wolf nature to fight back. After being shot through the body, he still lost consciousness helplessly. After hearing everything, Mason asked where the others had gone. Cedric told him that most of them had been taken elsewhere on the way, though fortunately some of his tribe had ended up here with him. At first, he had only wanted to fight back and protect them. Then, those people locked him up and tortured him. And while they were talking right now, the kidnappers had probably already sold his people off as slaves. Hearing that, Mason stood up. They had to get out of there as quickly as possible and then seek help from outside. But how were they supposed to get out? The door was locked from the outside. Cedric told him there was an opening in the ceiling. Maybe they could get out that way. So in the end, Mason stood on Cedric's shoulders and successfully climbed up. Before leaving, he promised Cedric that he would definitely come back to rescue him. After getting out of the cell, Mason anxiously searched for a way out. But instead, he accidentally discovered the imprisoned beast folk and those young demon creatures. Below, two traffickers were still discussing where to start with the sales. Mason's disgust toward them welled up in his heart. Suddenly, a large hand covered his mouth and nose and pulled him backward. The two traffickers who heard the noise looked over, but there was nothing there. In the end, they assumed it was just a sound made by the imprisoned beast folk. At that moment, Mason was being held against the wall, his mouth covered by the second male lead. Only after the two men left did he let Mason go. Mason quickly retreated a few steps and asked warily who he was and why he was helping him. The other man said nothing, but his gaze fell on a bite mark at Mason's neck. His expression darkened at once. "What are you doing here? Hasn't anyone ever told you not to sneak around dangerous places?" Mason froze in confusion, completely unable to understand what the man was thinking. Then the man slowly stepped closer and backed Mason against the wall. "It seems you still haven't listened to other people's advice. Look what happened when you came here. You even got bitten by a wild dog." The second male lead had finally made his move. "Don't worry. What I've always wanted is only you." The scene before them was one of forceful intimacy. Seeing the bite mark on the male lead's neck, the second male lead, Duke, was both worried and angry. This is what happens when you don't behave. "Look, you got bitten by a dog." The pressure at his fingertips made Mason very uncomfortable. Furious, he shoved him away. "Who exactly are you? Why are you talking about me as if you know everything about me?" A trace of amusement flashed through Duke's eyes. "Let's talk about that later. Right now, other than me, no one can help you get out of here." Mason had no idea what he meant. Just then, the voices of the knights could be heard. Only then did Mason realize that this was the same place Regina had mentioned that morning. Duke told Mason that even with the knight order here, things would not be so easy to resolve. Mason pressed his lips together. "Then how am I supposed to trust you? The fact that you know who I am is suspicious enough. For all I know, you may have ulterior motives." Duke smiled faintly. "So you're not stupid after all. Fine, I'll help you leave this place. But in exchange, I want you to do me a favor." "How about it? Isn't that simpler than you imagined?" Before Mason could think further, the whole building began to shake. It turned out Regina had led the knights in and successfully captured one of the traffickers. But while they were speaking, the trafficker hurled an explosive magic stone. Duke frowned. "Looks like someone detonated a bomb. They must be trying to destroy the evidence. We'd better leave before the building collapses. As for those imprisoned beast folk, if they're lucky, the knights will save them. Otherwise, they can only wait to be crushed to death." Thinking of Cedric's hopeful eyes before he left, Mason, even though he still had no idea how he could possibly help Duke, had no choice but to agree to his condition. At the same time, Regina cast a protective spell, which shielded them from the blast of the explosive magic stone. She ordered the knights to complete all rescue operations before the building collapsed. Not long after, the imprisoned beast folk were already being rescued by Duke and Mason. Regina found it suspicious. Even the explosion didn't explain how all the beast folk had managed to break out of their cages at once. There was only one explanation. Besides them, someone else was here. But for now, the priority was getting everyone out safely. Meanwhile, Mason led Duke to the cell where Cedric was imprisoned. Since Duke had been the one unlocking the other cells to release the beast folk, Mason immediately urged him to open this one as well. But Duke told him that the core of this lock was set with a special magic stone, and he couldn't open it. "Maybe you can try." At first, Mason absolutely didn't believe him. If Duke couldn't open it, how could someone with no magic, possibly do it? But the moment he touched the lock, the door opened on its own. Mason froze, utterly unable to believe he had actually succeeded. Duke seemed to confirm that his instinct had been right. Mason wasn't without magic at all. He simply had a special trait. He could neutralize all magic power. Hearing that, Mason was confused. He didn't think the original Mason had possessed such a constitution. Most likely, after he possessed this body, something had changed. Seeing that Mason had really come back to save him, Cedric was deeply grateful. The three of them left the cell and retreated outward. Unexpectedly, they ended up on a rooftop. Duke calmly explained that when a building is collapsing, taking a route downward is extremely dangerous. Mason exploded. It's this high. What? Are we supposed to bungee jump down? I'm just an ordinary person. I'm not like you two. I can't do that. I'd rather be crushed to death. The two men looked at each other. What's bungee jumping? At that moment, the voices of the knights came from outside. Mason jumped in alarm. Commander, I hear something on the roof. Mason panicked. If Regina found him there, he was definitely going to get beaten. Cedric noticed his panic and suggested they jump now. He would stay behind to buy them time. The moment he heard jump, every inch of Mason's skin screamed that he refused. But the very next second, Duke lifted him into his arms and sternly warned him, if you don't want to fall on the way down, don't move. Before they left, Cedric stopped them and asked for Mason's name. Thinking it probably wasn't a problem, Mason told him. But to his surprise, the next second Cedric took Mason's hand and lightly kissed it. Mason, I will never forget what you did for me today. If we meet again, I swear. Before he could finish, Duke changed his grip and pulled Mason tightly into his arms. His blazing gaze was full of warning. Then, holding Mason, he walked straight to the edge of the roof and jumped without even giving Mason time to prepare. So when Regina reached the roof, only Cedric was left standing there. When asked where the people who had helped them escape had gone, Cedric said he didn't know. By the time he came out, they had already disappeared. In the end, Regina activated a teleportation array and led everyone out of the ruins. Meanwhile, with Duke's help, Mason was practically flying over rooftops and walls. A little later, when Mason looked down, he saw his own home below. Standing on the balcony of his bedroom, he was still in shock. How did Duke know where he lived? Had they met before? Duke told him this wasn't their first meeting. But before that, he said, I already promised to get you home safely. We had a deal. You promised you'd do something for me. Mason was not someone who broke his word. He promised that if it was within his power, he would help. But he wouldn't do anything involving money or anything that would put his life in danger. Duke chuckled and pinned Mason against the wall. Don't worry. What I want is only you. There it was, the second male lead. The grand three-way showdown between the second male lead, the male lead, and the protagonist was beginning. Who would win his favor? At this moment, Duke, the second male lead, made his move strongly. Mason, the only thing I've ever wanted is you. Mason was completely dumbfounded. What do you mean you want me for? Only after Duke clearly explained that what he needed was Mason's ability did Mason finally breathe a sigh of relief. But in the very next second, Duke added leisurely, Mason, I don't think this will be difficult for you. You just need to stay by my side as much as possible. Mason nearly exploded. What do you mean, stay by your side as much as possible? Duke smiled faintly. You'll understand soon enough. Just wait for the day I come to take you. Mason had no idea what he meant. Why did it sound like some wolf had chosen a new bride and was telling her to wait for the groom to come fetch her? Even after Duke had gone, Mason remained standing there in a daze. What nonsense was that guy talking about? But as for who Duke really was and what he meant by Mason's ability, Mason was left with even more questions. The next day, Dr. Felix came, as usual, to check on Mason. But after knocking for quite a while with no response from inside, he anxiously opened the bedroom door. He found Mason lying in bed, his whole body burning hot with fever. At the same time, after Cedric had been taken out of the building by Regina and reunited with his tribe, he learned that his younger sister had been beaten by traffickers and abandoned in the wilderness, her fate unknown. He knew very well that although they had survived, the matter was far from over. He hated his own helplessness. He couldn't even protect his own sister, let alone the rest of his people. So when the Crown Prince came to inspect the current progress, Cedric did not hesitate to ask the Crown Prince for a chance and permission to join the Imperial Knights. He swore that he would be loyal to the Empire and to His Highness unto death. After all, werewolves were known for their loyalty. At first, Carl refused, thinking Cedric's desire for revenge made it too personal. But Cedric sincerely said that yes, he did want revenge. But even more than that, he hoped the tragedy of that day would not befall any other beast folk. He would pursue every criminal as a beast folk knight, and at the same time gain the power to prevent future attacks. Hearing that, Carl still decided to give him one chance to prove his loyalty. After returning to the palace, Regina suddenly came looking for him. Because the necklace contained the crown prince's magic, Regina recognized it immediately. However, she did not know that Carl had given the necklace to Mason. In the end, she still placed it before Carl. From Regina, he learned it had been found in the trafficker's hideout. Carl darkly declared that he would investigate the matter personally. So he summoned his shadow guards and ordered them to investigate Mason's recent movements. He wanted to know everything about him. Meanwhile, the unsuspecting Mason had already woken up with Felix's help, only to be subjected to a long round of scolding and concern. Not wanting to listen to Felix nag, Mason asked him to hand over the newspaper instead. Unexpectedly, he saw a report about a saintess with holy power. She was the game's true heroine, Yulia. It looked like the game was about to begin. Felix told him that besides that article, there was another major piece of news. Duke Roe and his heir had died in an accident, and one of his illegitimate sons had become the new heir, drawing widespread attention. Originally, Mason thought it had nothing to do with him at all, but when he saw the name in the paper, he was shocked. It was Duke, the most mysterious character in the game. He remembered that in the game, this character only inherited the Duke's territory after the heroine entered the academy. But now, something had changed up close, and it had happened ahead of schedule. Before he could recover from the shock, Butler Owen came in to tell him that the Crown Prince had summoned him. It turned out the Crown Prince had learned that Mason had been taken into that building that day, and had eventually escaped with someone else's help. But the person who helped him had hidden themselves too well, and no trace of them had been found. He had also told the Crown Prince that Mason wasn't actually without magic. He did have an ability. So when Mason stepped into the Crown Prince's bedchamber, Carl's expression was terrifyingly dark, especially after seeing the bandages on Mason's body. Carl advanced with palpable pressure. "Looks like you've been enjoying yourself lately." Before Mason could react, Carl angrily yanked down the collar covering his neck. "This doesn't look like an ordinary scuffle. Is this your usual form of entertainment?" Mason was speechless. Why was he saying all this pointless nonsense? Only when Carl took out the necklace did Mason freeze. This was found 3 days ago in the hideout of the Dirkfall gang. Is that just a coincidence? Mason's heart began to pound in panic. Only then did he realize that everything Carl had said earlier had just been probing him. In fact, he already knew. At that point, Mason felt there was no need to lie anymore. "Yes, I was there, but that has nothing to do with you. And I don't think I should have been treated so roughly just now." At that, Carl grew even angrier. "That place was dangerous. I was worried about you." Mason got angry too. He didn't think Carl was worried about him at all. He was obsessed. Otherwise, why would he befriend someone like him, the fallen son of a baron's family? But he didn't want to talk about any of that now. With that, Mason turned to leave, but Carl grabbed him hard once more. No matter how angrily Mason told him to let go, Carl didn't move an inch. And just as the two were struggling, the door slowly opened from outside. He already made himself very clear. You should let him go. A full three-way confrontation had begun. Duke forcefully pulled the male lead over to his side. "He's mine." Mason was stunned. What the hell? Naturally, he did not recognize that the person before him was the black-clad man who had helped him escape from the trafficker's hideout. Only when Duke's gentle voice reached his ear did he say, "Didn't I tell you I'd come to take you soon?" Mason practically lost his memory on the spot. But before he could speak, Carl was already furious. "Duke, what are you doing? This is rude. I suggest you let him go right now." But Duke didn't move at all. The possessiveness in his eyes was utterly undisguised. "How I treat him isn't important. What matters is that he belongs to me." Carl was furious and could only turn to ask Mason if it was true. Caught off guard, Mason felt completely unsettled. Seeing that, Duke stroked the wound at Mason's neck and said, "I think this already explains it. So from now on, I'll handle everything related to him. You only need to inform me. There's no need to summon him into the palace anymore. From now on, anything involving Mason is my concern." With that, he took Mason and left the Crown Prince's chambers. Carl could only watch helplessly as Mason was taken away, fury surging from his eyes. Why did it have to be him? I can't let him take Mason away. I have to get Mason away from there. The sound of knuckles cracking echoed in the air. He remembered what Mason had said just now, that he wasn't worried, but obsessed. Carl himself didn't know why, but he simply could not tolerate Mason being with someone else. nor could he tolerate Mason keeping other secrets from him. And the fact that Mason didn't care about his feelings at all made him furious. But then he realized this feeling didn't seem to be obsession. Only then did it hit him that perhaps he had fallen in love with Mason. Not long after they walked out, Mason angrily shook Duke off and asked if he was really the man from that incident. Duke stayed perfectly calm. "If you don't believe me, I can hold you in my arms again. I don't mind if we try one more time." Mason was furious, so it really was him. He had actually gotten involved with someone he never should have mixed with. "Maybe I can change your mind. I don't know why you'd want me, but I'm more useless than you think." But in the face of Mason's self-mockery, Duke didn't care at all. "You don't have to do anything. You just have to stay by my side, and I'll provide you with a comfortable place to live, good treatment, and plenty of money to spend. The conditions are far better than what you have now, so stop complaining." Although Mason thought that did sound pretty good, the problem was that this man was impossible. After all, he was also one of the protagonists in the game. If he stayed by his side, he had no idea when he might lose his life. Seeing Mason say nothing, Duke smiled in amusement. "Fine, I won't force you, but if you don't keep your promise, you'll have to pay the price." The boy who was kicked into an Otom game by his younger sister only wanted to stay far away from the protagonists, but instead, the male leads who were originally supposed to revolve around the heroine all began clinging to him. Ever since Duke's warning, Mason knew he'd better keep his promise. Otherwise, he'd have to pay the proper price. Mason lived every day in fear, always afraid Duke would come looking for him. As for the Crown Prince, after that huge fight with Mason, and after unexpectedly realizing his feelings for him, the two of them never contacted each other again. At first, Mason felt a little guilty. Maybe he'd been too harsh on Carl, but when he thought of his miserable fate in the game, he still did his best to comfort himself, telling himself he had done something truly great. Meanwhile, Eric had received the title of Baron and control of the Knox family. Mason knew very well that from now on he could never do whatever he wanted again. While worrying about his future, Eric came to find him, saying there was something he wanted to discuss in private. Mason had just sat down when Eric suddenly tossed a letter from Duke to Mason onto the table. "I don't know how you ended up getting acquainted with Duke, but you should know this. Duke's family is the one that controls all the royal family's dirty secrets. And he's also an illegitimate son no one knows about." Eric complained that the people Mason got involved with were of no help to the family at all. After saying that, he took out another letter, an admission notice from the academy, and threw it in front of Mason. Mason panicked. After all, the game started at the academy. He hurriedly explained to Eric that there had to be some mistake. He had absolutely no magic at all, but Eric didn't care about that. He gave Mason 3 choices. Either choose one of them or work under him. Thinking about working for Eric, Mason knew he'd definitely be used like a slave every single day. He refused, no matter what. But was he really supposed to serve a dangerous man with unclear motives like Duke? Or follow the game's setting and enter the academy to study? Mason was caught in a dilemma. No matter which option he chose, it was dangerous. Meanwhile, for a long time, Rossi had actually been exchanging letters with Uriel. Hearing that Rossi had recently fallen ill, Uriel specially wrote her a letter of concern, saying she was looking forward to meeting her at the academy. She also specifically mentioned that she wanted to introduce a very special maid to her. And so, the day school finally started at the academy arrived. Uriel held Rossi's reply in her hands, her heart full of anticipation. Suddenly, she noticed the maid beside her using a curling iron on her hair. The maid told her it was a tool for curling hair. "Why can't girls pay attention to their bangs?" Uriel laughed. "Aunt Shwe, you're always so interesting." Yes, she was the very same younger sister from the real world who had kicked Mason into this Otom game. This was bad. The original male lead and female lead of the game had met, and the villainess was there too. Mason panicked. Wasn't this basically the moment his death flag drew near? But why did the plot feel a little off? Why had the heroine thrown herself into the villainess's arms? Wasn't she supposed to throw herself into the Crown Prince male lead's arms? At first, when Mason had to choose between going to the Magic Academy or going to Duke's side, he had been torn. No matter which choice he made, it would be dangerous. But compared to staying every second beside a dangerous man with unclear motives, never knowing when he might die, he had no choice but to come to the Magic Academy, the place where the game began. After all, this was the only plotline he knew. At the freshman entrance ceremony, Mason made up his mind. Since he had no choice but to come here, as long as he kept a clear head, maybe he could survive. Aside from avoiding drawing attention as much as possible, he figured that once the academy discovered he had no magic, he would be expelled. At that point, he'd take the money he had saved and flee this place. But before he could even think that far, he was almost scared to death by the cheers and screams. It turned out the Crown Prince was giving a speech as student council president. No wonder the girls below were screaming their heads off, looking at the radiant man on stage. Maybe it was because he was the male lead of this game, but Mason had to admit that he really was the most handsome man in this world. If they hadn't grown up together, with Carl always around him, then if this had been his first time seeing him, even he would have been stunned. At that moment, Carl on stage noticed Mason below, but awkwardly turned his head away and refused to look at him. After it ended, Rossi held a bouquet and said to Mason, "The three of us can finally be together again." Then she pulled Mason along to show him around the academy. Mason didn't want Carl following them, so he subtly hinted that on the first day, for freshmen, Carl had to be very busy. After all, he was the student council president. But Carl only smiled brightly, as if he hadn't understood. "No, I'm not busy. The other student council members have already taken care of everything." Mason had no choice but to let Rossi drag him across the academy. But after only a few steps, a flying handkerchief smacked right into Mason's face. Just as everyone was standing there in confusion, a young woman hurried over and apologized. But when Mason saw that the person was Uriel, he almost turned to stone on the spot. Wasn't this the heroine's entrance scene in the game? Mason was so shocked he forgot to return the handkerchief, until Uriel walked up to him, blushing. "I'm sorry. This is a handkerchief I treasure very much. Could you return it to me?" Only then did he hand it back to her. Then Uriel suddenly asked Mason's name. Mason, Rossi, and Carl all froze. He had almost forgotten the Crown Prince male lead was still standing right there. And now the male lead, the female lead, and the villain were all here at once. Was this story going to end just as it began? No. He had to stop the male lead and heroine from getting acquainted right now. But in the next second, Uriel suddenly threw herself into Rossi's arms instead, excitedly saying she had missed her so much. Carl seemed to let out a breath of relief, while Mason looked completely stunned. He couldn't understand why the heroine was hugging Rossi instead of the prince. He didn't remember the story in the game starting like this. Rossi, how do you know the heroine? I mean, do you know her?" Only then did Uriel reluctantly let go. She gave Mason a curtsy, apologized for her rudeness, and briefly introduced herself. Mason felt awkward, but as soon as he introduced himself, Uriel excitedly grabbed his hand. "So you're Mason. Rossi has told me so much about you. I was in such a panic just now. I didn't expect you and Miss Rossi to really look so alike." Uriel's lively personality left Mason completely baffled. He didn't remember the Uriel in the game being like this. Just as Uriel kept chattering on and on, still about to say more, Carl walked over, unable to stay calm. "You must be the lady who possesses the power of the Saintess. It's a pleasure to see you at the academy." The black-bellied Duke was about to punish the male lead. He had secretly sent people to investigate Mason. Mason had run away from his side and entered the Magic Academy, although he found Mason's protest rather cute. A broken promise was still a broken promise, and he would have to pay the price. Mason had originally thought that as long as he didn't attract attention and quietly waited for the academy to discover he had no magic and expel him, then he could take his savings and flee. But he hadn't expected that on his very first day. Ever since Uriel met him, she had happily sat beside him. With the heroine's halo, Mason became the center of everyone's attention again, added to the terrible reputation he already had. Mason felt horribly uncomfortable under all those eyes. After thinking about it, he took the initiative to speak. Uriel, don't you feel uncomfortable sitting here? Maybe you should sit somewhere else. Look, there are lots of empty seats over there." But Uriel seemed not to catch his meaning at all. "No, I'm fine. Please don't worry about me." Mason felt like crying. "Well, I mean, is that I mind, okay?" Listening to the unkind whispers from the students behind him, all worrying that Mason might bully Uriel, yet not daring to come forward because of his bad reputation. Mason chose to leave Uriel instead and went straight to sit alone in an empty corner. But as soon as he left, Uriel was surrounded by a group of students, all asking at once whether she had been hurt and whether she needed help. After all, Mason had an awful reputation. They said that recently, while drunk, he had tried to harass a lady and had even beaten someone to death. "Miss Uriel, you should be careful too. Getting involved with a troublemaker like him won't bring you any good at all." Uriel looked toward Mason in the distance. Ever since meeting him, she had never believed he was that kind of person. Mason couldn't be bothered to care about what they were saying. After all, he had never done any of it. But he hadn't expected that the professor who came in to teach next would actually be his second sister, Alina. So as soon as class ended, Mason impatiently asked Alina why she was here. Wasn't she supposed to be working in a laboratory? Alina didn't answer his question. Instead, rather displeased, she asked why he hadn't told them about his new ability. Mason was stunned. How did his second sister know about that? Alina explained that the Crown Prince had come to find her and asked her to help Mason because he might not be able to control his ability. Only then did Mason realize that Carl had been secretly investigating him all along. He even suspected that a large part of the reason he had received the Academy admission notice was because of Carl. After a pause, Alina took off her glasses in disappointment. Honestly, the worst part is that I had to hear from someone else that you had developed a new ability. Mason explained that he hadn't meant to hide it from her. He had only discovered the ability not long ago, and it wasn't anything special, so he hadn't mentioned it. Alina affectionately handed him a small pouch. Whether your ability is special or not doesn't matter. I just want you to know that you can rely on me, because we're family. Meanwhile, back at the ducal residence, Duke was staring with amused interest at letter after letter from the Academy about Mason spread across the table. So that's where you went after running away from me. Such a childish little protest is rather cute. But you have no idea you've fallen into that bastard's trap. No matter what, Mason, you'll have to pay the price for breaking your word and running away from me. The noble young master got drunk, and in his dazed state, one of the male leads took advantage of him. A week after Mason entered the Academy, aside from those irritating stares always following him around, everything in the plot had been progressing smoothly. But those rumors people were spreading, if it had been the original owner of this body, maybe he really would have done such things. But as for him, to avoid unnecessary trouble, there was no way he'd gamble like that. So where exactly had those rumors come from? As he was thinking, 3 male students stopped him and dragged him into a corner, saying they wanted to have a proper talk with him. Mason had completely forgotten who they were until the one in front sneered that they were old friends. He also said that no matter how hard Mason tried to turn over a new leaf, in the end it would all become worthless because of what came out of his mouth. Only then did Mason remember that these were the punks from the original owner's memories, the ones who used to mock him for having no magic. So they had spread those rumors in retaliation for what he had done before. Mason couldn't help laughing out loud, mocking them for the fact that their best method of revenge was to use baseless rumors that didn't even exist. That's why you got kicked in the ass back then, remember? Because you couldn't keep your mouth shut. Hearing that, the boy's face twisted with rage. He grabbed Mason by the collar and was about to swing at him. Luckily, when Mason was forcibly dragged away by them, Uriel happened to see it. Hearing that someone was coming over with a professor, the boys had no choice but to let Mason go for the moment and leave. After they left, Uriel finally came out and asked in concern whether he was all right. At first, Mason thanked her and hoped she would stay away from him to avoid getting dragged into trouble. But Uriel sincerely said that she didn't think Mason was the kind of bad person they claimed he was. Uriel came up with an idea. At the freshmen's gathering, she could help clear up all the rumors about him. Then they wouldn't bully him anymore. She even said she would do her best to help him. Seeing how concerned Uriel looked, Mason reluctantly went to attend the freshmen's party that night. But surrounded by all those hostile stares, and with Uriel unable to leave her seat at all, he thought he should just leave. Then suddenly, the male student hosting the gathering somehow appeared beside him and suggested they play a drinking game to break the awkward mood. The first round was to say the name of the person you liked. But if you didn't have one, or didn't want to say, then you have to drink. As he said that, he pointed at a girl sitting opposite them. In front of all the new students, she was being forced to say the name of the person she liked. The girl held her cup tightly, completely at a loss. Everyone's eyes were on her, and she looked so pressured she was about to cry. Playing the hero, Mason stood up, took the cup from the person beside him, and helped the girl out. So when Crown Prince Carl arrived, Mason was already arm in arm with the male students, drinking enthusiastically. Uriel had also drunk too much and was clinging to Rossi, refusing to let go. Looking at the cheerful flush on Mason's face and the way he was smiling so happily, Rossi said, she really hadn't seen him smile that happily in a long time. Is that so? Prince Carl said nothing, but stared fixedly at Mason. Before long, Mason couldn't hold his liquor anymore and collapsed from drinking too much. One of the male students was still about to pour him another drink. Carl walked over, unable to remain calm, and asked with a faint smile, "What exactly are you doing?" Hearing his voice, Mason groggily woke up. Carl called to him with concern, telling him to get up and saying he would take him back to the dormitory. But Mason refused, saying he could go back on his own and didn't need Carl to interfere. Before leaving, he repeatedly warned Carl not to follow him and not to have anyone investigate him anymore. Otherwise, he would never forgive him. Watching Mason walk away alone, Carl gave a helpless cold laugh. Forgive? Who exactly is forgiving whom? At that moment, Uriel asked worriedly, "Are you really going to let him go back by himself? I'm worried those people will bully him again." Over here, Mason staggered back toward the dormitory. Before long, his vision blurred and he could barely make out the people in front of him. Unfortunately, he ran into those same male students who had bullied him at noon. Seizing the opportunity, they tried to take revenge on Mason again. But Mason couldn't see who was in front of him at all, and in the end, it was easy for one of them to push him down onto the ground. Seeing how drunk Mason was, one of the boys suddenly became interested. He pinched Mason's chin and revealed an evil, amused smile. Luckily, someone suddenly walked over. When they saw who it was, the boys were too frightened to stir again. Then, still in a daze, Mason was thrown onto a large bed. Someone was sitting beside it. Feeling miserable, he tossed and turned, wanting water. But in the end, something was pressed to his lips instead. He opened his eyes hazily, but couldn't see clearly who the person in front of him was. He only felt a pair of cold hands touching him. Crown Prince Carl took the initiative to seek Mason out. He even wanted to talk to him alone. Could it be that the person who took Mason back last night was him? The next morning, Mason's eyes flew open. With the hazy memories of the previous night still lingering, he gasped in disbelief. He had never expected to dream that kind of dream. After all, in the real world, he was already in his 30s. Then he saw the large and small bite marks on his legs. He froze. He hurried to the mirror, and what he saw there forced him to admit it. Last night had not been a dream. But as for who that person had been, the infuriating part was that he truly couldn't remember at all. While he was agonizing over it, Uriel suddenly leaned in front of him. "Mason, what's wrong? I've called you several times, and you didn't hear me." Mason was so startled that he quickly covered his neck, afraid the marks there would be seen, and awkwardly said it was nothing. But his embarrassed expression still made Uriel ask whether something bad had happened between him and the Crown Prince last night. Mason froze. Why would she say that? "Because I was worried about you going back alone last night. So I told Crown Prince Carl what happened before when you were being bullied. Then the Crown Prince immediately chased after you. But he came back right away and his face looked gloomy. So I just wondered whether something had happened between you and the Crown Prince." Hearing that, Mason panicked. He suspected the one who had taken him back last night was Carl, and that he had left those strange marks on his body. He was really going crazy. How desperately he wished it had all just been a dream. At that moment, the girl he had helped out last night walked over smiling shyly and confessed her feelings to him. And after what had happened the night before, the other students' attitudes toward Mason also changed a lot. They apologized for all the bad things they had said before based on baseless rumors and for isolating him. They hoped he would forgive them and become friends with them. Although Mason was momentarily overwhelmed by suddenly receiving so much friendliness, he figured it was at least a good thing that people would no longer call him a troublemaker who only caused problems. After class, for some reason, Uriel kept sticking close to Mason, chatting endlessly to him. But he had absolutely no mind for anything else now. His whole head was filled with what had happened the night before. Lost in thought, he suddenly bumped straight into someone. Mason was just about to apologize and leave when he looked up and, of all people, saw the same classmate who had bullied him before. What rotten luck. Mason thought that this time the guy definitely wouldn't let him go. Uriel stood to the side in fear, not daring to make sound. Just as the male student bared his teeth and was about to say something, Carl and Rossi suddenly walked over and asked if they were heading to the dining hall for lunch. Carl shot the male student a warning look, and the boy could only leave resentfully. Only then did Mason let out a sigh of relief. Still, for some reason, the scene just now felt strangely familiar to him. Little did he know it was exactly like what had happened while he was drunk the night before. Rossi handed over 2 hangover drinks. Since both of them had drunk too much last night, she thought they might need them. Uriel was thrilled because Rossi had given one to her. Mason, on the other hand, looked at the hangover medicine in his hand and felt even worse. Then, as thanks, Uriel warmly invited Rossi to go eat at the dining hall with her. She said she'd buy her anything she liked. At that, Mason panicked. If they left, wouldn't that mean only he and Carl would be left behind? Just as he was about to say something, Carl spoke first. "Do you have time? I'd like to talk to you." The male lead, after getting drunk and not knowing who had carried him back and done what to him, had been uneasy all day long. He kept guessing who that person really was. And now, of all times, Carl wanted to talk to him alone. Mason's heart was in complete turmoil. Was Carl about to talk about what happened that night? Just as he waited for fate's judgment, Carl instead suddenly and sincerely apologized for his rudeness at the Royal Palace Hotel last time. He said that after Mason left that day, he had thought about many things. He admitted that he had indeed been obsessed with him, but the thought of making him uncomfortable made him hate himself. After that, he had also tried to adjust his attitude and keep a certain distance from Mason, but he found that he still worried about him very much. Even knowing Mason might hate him for following him, he had still done it. Mason had considered forgiving Carl, but even if he did, it felt as though nothing would actually change. Angrily, he questioned Carl. His coming to the Magic Academy was probably because of Carl, and he also didn't know how Carl had learned about his ability. Because of those points alone, he couldn't believe what Carl was saying. Hearing this, Carl stopped hiding it. He admitted directly that he had indeed sent the Academy admission invitation, but everything he had done was to keep Mason away from Duke. After all, Duke was a very dangerous person. No one knew what exactly he was plotting. Even now, they still hadn't figured out how he had become a Duke. But one thing Carl was certain of was that his father's death had not been an accident. He didn't know why Duke had approached Mason, but the only way to safely keep Mason away from him was to bring him into the academy. Mason felt that Carl's obsession with him had reached a certain point, and maybe it had something to do with what he had experienced. Not long after Carl's mother, the queen, died, Duke Ro's daughter married the emperor and became the new queen. She cunningly stole away the young crown prince's place and slowly increased her influence within the royal family. After the birth of the second prince, the new queen began desiring the title of crown prince for her own son. Therefore, Carl had to become a perfect crown prince to protect his title from being taken by the queen. So he had no choice but to live that way, simply in order to survive. Everyone who approached him had ulterior motives. But Mason's chance encounter with him had been a refreshing change in his monotonous life. Maybe Mason was even the only person who could bring him happiness. Suddenly, Carl took Mason's hand with deep feeling. "Mason, I know my behavior was wrong, but what I fear even more is drifting farther and farther away from you. I don't care whether you still think of me as a friend. I just don't want you to leave my side. You're the only thing I have left." In the end, Mason softened after all. "Fine, I forgive everything you've done up to now, but on one condition. You can't have people investigate me without my knowledge, and you have to treat me the same way you treat the other students." Hearing that, Carl finally broke into a smile. After saying that, Mason stood up and said they should go, since the lunch break was almost over. But before he had taken even one step, Carl suddenly said, "By the way, about last night." Mason was scared out of his wits. "Last night? What about last night?" Carl's expression clearly turned awkward for a moment. Then a faint blush appeared on his face. Actually, it was nothing. Mason was even more alarmed. What kind of reaction was that supposed to be? But just as they separated and headed toward the classroom, Mason was suddenly grabbed by a large hand. "Long time no see, Mason. Did you enjoy running away?" He was here, the dark and scheming Grand Duke, with the possessive crown prince and the jealous Duke both sticking close to him every step of the way. What was he supposed to do? Mason had just parted from Carl, but after only a few steps, Duke hooked him back with one arm. "Did you have fun with your little runaway game? What was he here for?" Mason looked confused, but before he could speak, Duke said with interest, "Didn't I tell you that if you broke our agreement, you'd be punished? It seems you've already prepared yourself for that." "What? Wait. Mason panicked. Luckily, Carl chased after them and pulled Mason out of Duke's arms. "Didn't I tell you not to treat Mason that way? It seems you've never taken my words seriously." The tension between Duke and Carl flared at once. "Your Highness, have you forgotten? I told you before as well. He is my property. How I treat him has nothing to do with you." "What kind of nonsense is that? How is he your property?" "I already told you. He's a person, not an object." The two of them went back and forth, neither yielding an inch. What exactly were they doing? Mason watched in complete shock. Suddenly, Carl pulled Mason behind him protectively. Mason is now a registered student of the academy. I won't let you do whatever you want to him. Duke smiled faintly. So this is how you took him away from me. That's also why I came to the academy in person. Although it's not exactly pleasant, it seems that from now on, we'll be seeing each other often. From then on, the two of them stuck to Mason like glue, whether in the dining hall or in the library. Even if he just wandered off for a few minutes, they were both there beside him. They even waited outside when he went to the restroom. Mason's patience finally reached its limit. How long are you two going to keep this up? Your Highness, doesn't the student council have anything to do? And as the head of a ducal household, don't you have anything more important to attend to? Neither of them spared the other with their words, each wishing the other would leave. Because of the secret between him and Duke that couldn't be told to anyone, Mason needed to talk to Duke privately. But first, all he could do was follow the agreement he had made with Carl before, and remind him that he had promised to treat him like any other student, hoping Carl would stop pestering him. Duke was delighted. Your Highness, you should leave now. Because he had promised Mason, Carl didn't want to destroy the relationship they had only just repaired. But before leaving, he seriously warned Mason that if Duke did anything to hurt him, he had to tell him. After Carl left, Mason first apologized for running away. But because the person offering him all those favorable conditions had been Duke, he had no choice but to run. And frankly speaking, he didn't like Duke's attempt to bind him either, nor did he understand why Duke wanted to by his side. If what Duke wanted was his ability, they could simply agree to meet periodically. He didn't want to be restricted for some uncertain length of time. But Duke repeatedly reminded him that. Back then, Mason had given up his freedom himself to save those beastmen, so he had no right to refuse at all. And if I truly wanted to possess you, I would kidnap you and lock you somewhere with no sunlight, so I could stay by your side for the rest of your life. But I didn't do that entirely because of you, and yet you still ran away. A large hand seized Mason by the neck of fate, and his body began trembling instinctively. He even felt as if he were about to suffocate for a moment. Duke smiled with unreadable amusement, then finally let go when he looked at the person before him. Before leaving, he warned Mason again not to run away from him anymore, because no matter where he went, Duke would always be able to find him. What crazy bastard. Mason gasped for air and cursed under his breath. On the way back, the more he thought about it, the angrier he got. Just because they were male leads, they all toyed with him like this every day, and he really couldn't understand it. Duke clearly could have just used force and taken him away, but he hadn't. Mason couldn't understand what Duke wanted from him. Unable to figure it out, he grew frantic. Damn it, how was he supposed to run away again? But when he finally dawdled out of the bathroom, he froze all over again. You took so long in the bath, I thought you drowned in there. Here it comes. Everyone's been curious which male lead it was that night. This episode reveals it. The moment Mason stepped out of the bathroom, he saw Duke waiting there impatiently. When Mason demanded to know why he was here, Duke answered lightly, "Didn't I say I'd be watching you anytime, anywhere?" Mason couldn't be bothered arguing with him anymore and just wanted him to hurry up and leave his room. After all, he didn't want the academy to discover an outsider had entered his room and cause him trouble. But Duke only gave a cold, amused laugh. You're absolutely right. I imagine you also don't want anyone seeing those sexy marks on your body. Only then did Mason react and hurriedly pull his bathrobe tighter. Suddenly, Duke's expression turned serious. If you really can't remember what happened that night, then I think you should quit drinking. Mason's heart tightened. How do you know? How do I know? With a cold laugh, Duke suddenly yanked Mason down before he could react. If you really can't remember, maybe I can help you recall what exactly happened that night. Mason panicked. Wait. At the critical moment, there came an urgent knock at the door. It was Jude, here to apologize for getting Mason drunk before. Interrupted, someone stood up with a dark expression and went to open the door. Standing outside, Jude thought he had gone to the wrong room and immediately apologized. Not knowing what was happening, Mason hurriedly took the chance to straighten his clothes in a panic. Only when Duke told him the person had left did Mason finally breathe again, then angrily demanded to know whether Duke had gone insane. If someone had seen him, he'd be subjected to all those strange rumors again. But Duke looked puzzled instead and asked why he cared now when he hadn't cared about rumors before. Mason badly wanted to say, "Damn it, you don't understand. If the story of the game develops the way it's supposed to, he'll die in the end." In the end, all he could do was shout at Duke to leave immediately. He didn't want to be entangled with a pervert like him. But Duke wasn't angry at all. Instead, he laughed. I knew it. This version of you suits you much better than that fake exterior you've been trying to put on." Mason was visibly stunned. What annoying man. After a pause, Duke told him that would be all for today, and that he should return to his own room now. "All right, I'm also a student at the academy now." Mason was speechless. Is this really how we're playing it? Left with no solution, Mason even thought of going to find his second sister and telling her he wanted to withdraw from school. But he knew that with his second sister's personality, she would never allow him to quit so easily. She would only coldly tell him no. The next day, in order to avoid both Duke and the Crown Prince, Mason had no choice but to find a quiet place where no one would bother him. But he also knew this wasn't a long-term solution. It was only a matter of time before they found him. Just as he was thinking that, Jude suddenly appeared and nearly scared the life out of him. It turned out this place was Jude's secret hideout for skipping class. This was the first time he'd ever seen someone else here. Jude said bluntly that Mason was hiding from the Crown Prince and Duke. After all, everyone in the academy had seen the Crown Prince and Duke sticking to him at all times. People throughout the academy were saying the three of them had fallen into some kind of love triangle. And in fact, Duke had been in your room last night. At first I thought I'd gone to the wrong room, but I hadn't. Being in your room that late at night must have meant you two had something to do together. Seeing through him so easily, Mason spat out the drink he had just swallowed. He hurriedly explained that they had only been discussing something because he owed Duke something, but had no way to repay him, which was why he had run here. Jude couldn't help feeling a second of sympathy for him and comforted him by saying that nobles like Dukes usually wouldn't come to the academy often. For students like Duke, in addition to studying, they also have their own official duties. So the academy allows them, as long as they complete their studies, not to come very often. But that only made Mason even more troubled. In that case, he would be even less certain when Duke might suddenly appear. That night, when Mason returned to his bedroom, he lingered at the door and looked around for quite a while, only going in after making sure no one was inside. The direction things had developed and was something Mason had never expected. What should he do? What should he do? He was burning with anxiety, but utterly helpless. But what he never expected was that, just when Duke and the Crown Prince were already enough to give him a headache, the third male lead from the game appeared as well. In this Otome game, the wicked young master only wanted to change his tragic ending. Yet somehow all the male leads who were supposed to revolve around the heroine kept gathering around him instead. Originally, one Crown Prince and one scheming Duke were already more than Mason could handle. Now there was also a loyal hound-like knight. What was he supposed to do? What was he supposed to do? Ever since Cedric had been promised a place in the Royal Knights by Crown Prince Carl, he had continued investigating the human traffickers who had destroyed his village. Then one day, Regina suddenly came to find him because some illegal magic-enhancing potions had entered the academy. They were very likely connected to Duke, so the Crown Prince needed him to enter the academy under orders and gather more information. After all, as a werewolf, he possessed a dog's keen sense of smell and would surely be able to uncover some clues. After explaining everything, Regina still didn't forget to tease him and tell him to take good care of his younger brothers and sisters while he was there. Meanwhile, in swordsmanship class, Mason, because of Regina before, had always disliked swordsmanship, but given his current situation, he had no idea what kind of danger he might face or win, so he felt it was necessary to learn it after all. Yet, during swordsmanship class, the instructor suddenly introduced a new coach to them, a knight from the Imperial Knights who had become a master-level knight in the shortest time. The person who came in was Cedric. At a single glance, he recognized Mason among the students. But Mason was still lost in his own thoughts and didn't notice at all until class had been going for quite a while and Cedric walked over to his side. He even guided him step by step on how to do it. "I still can't believe you managed to escape the bandits' den in such a weak condition." Only then did Mason recognize the person in front of him. After they talked, he realized that Mason was the younger sibling Regina had mentioned. Mason awkwardly said he was sorry for not recognizing him earlier, because the injuries on his body were gone and his hair had been cut short too. Still, he generously praised him, saying his hair looked beautiful now too. As soon as he said that, Cedric's whole face turned red, and Mason immediately realized something was off. He quickly explained that he had only meant the hair color was very rare and hadn't been hinting at anything else. At that moment, Mason suddenly realized, wasn't there a male lead in the game? A beast man with silver hair? A knight. Only then did it hit him that the person before him was the game's third male lead. Then Cedric suddenly said that there were actually some things he had always wanted to say to him. He was deeply grateful that Mason had saved him back then. Without him, there would be no him now. As he spoke, he suddenly dropped to one knee. So here now, I swear to you, I, Cedric, leader of Wolfcry and commander of the First Imperial Knight Order, hereby vow to protect you under any circumstances from this day until the day I die. I swear I will never break this promise. The black-bellied Duke had another rival now. At noon, Mason and Rosie were eating together in the cafeteria. He thought of the Crown Prince, who called himself his good friend, yet always followed him around. Then the scheming Duke, who acted as if Mason belonged to him and wouldn't allow him to leave his side. And lastly, the Wolf Knight, who had sworn to protect him for life. The more Mason thought about it, the more irritated he became. The heroine was right there waiting for them to fight over her. So why were they always circling around him? Sitting beside him, Rosie saw his distress and asked with concern whether it was because of the Crown Prince. Because he had noticed that they seemed awkward even before entering the academy, and it was the same when they were with Duke too. Confused, he asked Mason if something had happened. Mason couldn't exactly say that he was being tangled up by the game's male leads, so he lied and said it was just because of sword practice in class. Nothing serious. Clearly, Rosie hadn't gotten the answer he wanted. He knew Mason wasn't telling him the truth. By now, he had already guessed that there was something between Mason and Carl that he didn't know about. At that moment, Uriel and Carl walked over together. The moment he saw Carl, Mason quickly got to his feet, wanting only to run, but Carl called him away. Whether Mason was willing or not, Carl enthusiastically moved close and stuck to his side. Rosie watched the two of them walk away. Carl smiled like that. He had never once directed it at him. His heart was filled with mixed emotions. Yet that fleeting glance of his also entered Uriel's eyes. He had wanted to share Rosie's worries, but in the end, Rosie gently turned him down. Uriel felt miserable. He thought he was useless. Rosie couldn't rely on him, and he didn't know how to say anything. Then Shui walked in and comforted him. Did something happen at the academy? Maybe you can tell me. Perhaps I can help. Uriel said he didn't know what to do. Someone very important to him seemed to be troubled by something. He wanted so badly to share that burden, but that person refused to tell him anything. He had thought they were close enough, but he had discovered he was wrong. Shui more or less understood now. This was the person Uriel liked. As a dedicated fan of the Otome game, of course, she had to help the heroine properly. She comforted Uriel, saying the best way was to let the other person know your true feelings. After all, sincerity is a killer move. But Uriel, dejectedly, said, what if that person starts avoiding you? As an Otome game fan, Shui found it unbelievable. Someone as beautiful as the heroine, who would avoid him? But if sincerity doesn't work, then first make sure that person won't avoid you anymore. Become the one they think of first. As she said this, she gave Uriel a very good idea. When he heard it, Uriel's whole face turned red. Meanwhile, Carl spent the whole day with Mason. When he escorted Mason to the dormitory door, Carl suddenly grabbed him and seriously asked whether something had happened between him and Duke. Mason instantly remembered the things Duke had done to him. Guiltily, he waved his hands and said nothing had happened. After hearing Mason deny it, Carl didn't press further. But once Mason had left, Carl finally let his intense possessiveness show. He had to take things slowly. He couldn't let Mason hate him anymore. But as for those dangerous people, he definitely wouldn't let them get close to him again. But late that night, while Mason was sound asleep, Duke climbed in through the window, fully armed. It had taken him a long time to find Mason, so this time he swore he'd never let him go again. The next morning, Mason woke up groggily. For some reason, his body felt very heavy. He thought it was because the bed itself was too small. But the next second, he realized something was wrong. It felt like he had touched something. When he opened his eyes, he found Duke lying right beside him. What does it feel like to wake up and find one of the Otome game's male leads lying next to you? At first, Mason only felt that his body was a little heavy, assuming it was because the bed was too small and he hadn't slept well. Then his gaze dropped and he saw an unbelievable sight. All drowsiness vanished as he looked over and finally realized that the person lying beside him was Duke. At the sound of a shout, loud enough to shake the room. Duke unhappily sat up in a leisurely way. Can you keep it down this early in the morning? What kind of joke was that? Try waking up to find a man lying next to you and see whether you can stay calm. I finally managed to relax when you weren't around. The way you just randomly appear is seriously terrifying. Okay. Hearing that, Duke laughed instead. So, what does that mean you missed me? Mason finally understood that this guy's brain simply wasn't built like a normal person's. Whatever. I want to keep sleeping in, so please leave immediately. Duke proposed that the weather was so nice. Why not go out for a walk? Whatever he wanted, he'd buy it for him. Mason grumbled inwardly. You're really unbelievable. Why would I go on a disguise date with you? If you want to go for a walk, go ahead, but my weekend plan is to spend it in bed. Hearing that, Duke's expression shifted. You really leave people with no choice. As soon as the words fell, Mason was caught off guard and yanked over. If that's what you want, then spending the whole day in bed doesn't sound like a bad idea. In the end, Mason gave in. After getting ready, Mason followed Duke as the two wandered through the city. He really couldn't understand it. As he remembered it, Duke's character in the game hated crowded places. After they had walked for a while, a stall owner suddenly called out to them, inviting them to look at a newly arrived batch of high-quality magic stones. Ever since Mason's father had forcibly taken away the magic stones he collected, Mason hadn't seen any for a long time. He had even started to think that maybe things like that only existed in fairy tales. Seeing how attentively he was looking, Duke came up behind him and enclosed him in his arms. Why are you looking at things you can't even use? What? I'm not allowed to have a hobby of collecting magic stones. Hearing this, Duke directly ordered them to pack up all the magic stones. He wanted all of them. Mason was furious and asked whether he was taking them just to mock him. Duke was in a very good mood. Of course not, because it's your hobby. I told you, whatever you want, I can give you. With that, he tossed the magic stones into Mason's arms. Mason himself didn't know why, but in a situation like this, he strangely felt as though something similar had happened to him before. At the same time, in order to help cheer Rosie up, Uriel invited Rosie out for a walk. He had decided that once Rosie felt better, he would follow Shuei's advice and tell Rosie his true feelings. But because he had been sickly since childhood and kept at home, he had never imagined that there were so many interesting things outside. The sights on the street dazzled him, and he was very happy. Seeing him like this, Rosie said that if he had known Uriel would be so happy, he would have brought him here long ago. At some point, a trace of blush crept onto Uriel's face. Then from now on, we can do things together. When the weather is nice, we can go on a picnic together. When it rains, we can stay indoors and read. I hope that when you're with me, you'll be happy. And I also hope that when you're going through hard times, I'll be the first person you think of. Because I want to be by your side, just like you were there for me when I was struggling. Rosie froze for a moment. Then a smile still appeared at the corner of his lips. How could I ever refuse you, Uriel? Mason had originally wanted to match the black-bellied Duke with the heroine so that he could get rid of the Duke's constant pestering. But he hadn't expected that one sentence from the Duke would leave him unable to clear his name. At the moment, Mason's hands and shoulders were piled full of things Duke had bought for him. At first, he had only wanted to deliberately annoy him. After all, Duke had said he'd buy him whatever he wanted. So whenever he saw something on a stall, he grabbed it at random. He never thought it would end up like this. Mason was so exhausted he plopped down on a stone bench. Either return them or leave them all here. Since the little wife was complaining, Duke could only use magic to store away all the shopping bags. But after wandering around all day without eating anything, Mason was hungry too. Just then, there happened to be a grilled meat stall not far away. Drooling, Mason called for Duke to buy him some food there. Duke looked over, but his expression clearly faltered. If the stall was still here, then that meant. He looked to the side. In the corner not far away, it was still just like before. Without realizing it, he had come back here. Mason thought Duke simply didn't want to buy him anything. So he went to the stall himself. Only after the food arrived did Mason seem to come back to life. While watching him eat so happily, the shop owner mentioned that there used to be an arrogant rich kid who often came here too. But every time he came, he was always alone. He was always like a hedgehog, so guarded and wary. But after that panic-inducing incident in the area, he had never been seen again. No one knew what became of that child. But if that child is still alive, he should be about your age now. Since he had transmigrated here, Mason had no memory at all of what exactly had happened in this place a few years ago. But he didn't know that the reason Duke sat there looking so pained was because when he was being bullied there as a child, a boy around his age had once tried to help him. And the reason he was sad now was because he alone remembered that abandoned past, while that person remembered nothing. How long are you going to sit here? Mason came back eating skewers and at the same time held out in front of Duke a skewer the shop owner had thrown in for free, just like the boy from back then. The two of them then found a restaurant. Duke told Mason to go in first and order, and he would follow after. Unexpectedly, Rosie and Uriel were there too. Uriel thought Mason was alone, so he warmly invited him to join them. Before Mason could explain, a large hand landed on his shoulder. I told you to go in and wait for me. I didn't tell you to immediately find a girl to hang out with. Mason hurriedly said they were just acquaintances and greeted them one by one, introducing the people before him as his cousin Rosie and Rosie's friend. Uriel politely introduced himself. Isn't this the rumored saint? Duke stared at the other person in surprise. In the game, Mason remembered that this character had originally been obsessed with the heroine. He remembered Duke had badly needed the saint's power. At once, a clever idea came to him. If he could connect Duke with the heroine, then Rosie would naturally end up falling in love with Carl too. Wouldn't that mean he could finally regain his freedom? So, without asking Duke's opinion at all, he enthusiastically dragged Duke into joining them. After all, wasn't it nice to make more friends? Duke's fists clenched so hard they cracked. Even so, he could only go along unwillingly. During the conversation, Mason learned that actually Rosie and Uriel had known each other for a long time. No wonder they had gotten along so well at the academy. While Mason was thinking that, Uriel suddenly asked how he and Duke had met. Since they were strolling around the city together, their relationship must be very close. Mason quickly explained that it was nothing much, really, just because of some special circumstances. But before he could finish, Duke suddenly spoke in a meaningful tone. Indeed, he has to stay by my side day and night, just like what he did this morning. Great. This time Mason had truly angered the black-bellied Duke. Originally, he had wanted to pair Duke with the heroine, Uriel. As long as those two ended up together, Rosie could naturally pair off with the crown prince. That way, not only could he escape the game's death ending, he could also completely break free from both the crown prince and Duke's entanglement. It would be killing two birds with one stone. But right in front of Uriel and Rosie, Duke said something suggestive. To keep this kind of situation from happening again, Mason resolved to speed up getting Duke and Uriel together. So next, he either deliberately moved closer to Uriel. Duke said he'll pay for everything today. If there's anything you want, just tell him directly. Or intentionally hinted that Duke should be more considerate toward Uriel. In short, he did everything he could to keep the two of them together. The result was easy to imagine. Furious, Duke pinned him against a wall and interrogated him about what scheme he was plotting this time. Suddenly, a flower pot slipping from above interrupted them. There was no time to dodge. Duke shielded Mason with his whole body. Afterward, Mason worried about him, but Duke merely waved him off, pretending nothing was wrong, and strode away. After that, Duke didn't stay angry with him either, and just quietly picked out gifts at the stalls because Uriel had already noticed early on how Duke felt about Mason, and even came over to comfort him, saying he had to keep treating Mason well, and that one day Mason would understand. And this harmonious scene between the two of them had originally been exactly what Mason wanted most to see, and Duke wasn't angry at him anymore either. But for some reason, his chest still felt a little uncomfortable. Just then, Rosie suddenly sat down beside him and finally asked the thing that had been troubling him all this time. He asked Mason what he thought of the Crown Prince, Carl. Mason had no idea Rosie was testing how he felt about Carl. He thought about it very seriously, then answered honestly that the Crown Prince was really too annoying. He was always meddling and doing whatever he wanted without caring about Mason's opinion. Anyway, to sum it up, he thought Carl was very annoying, but he also counted as a pretty good friend. Hearing Mason answer like that, Rosie clearly breathed a sigh of relief. Around then, Uriel and Rosie said goodbye to Mason. Mason was preparing to go back and get some proper rest, but unexpectedly, the grudge-holding Duke seized the chance to have a proper talk with him. So after returning to the dormitory, Mason was kneeling on the floor while being interrogated by Duke. Was what you did today meant to make me leave you, Mason? Mason explained that he just thought Uriel was more useful than him. After all, Uriel was the saint, and besides, compared to being with a man, wouldn't having a girl by your side be better? Why don't you give it a try with him? If you're willing, I'd even be happy to help. But the moment the words left his mouth, he was suddenly thrown aside. Isn't this exactly what you want me to do with him? You know, if I'm too aggressive and scare him away, what then? So you'll need to help me practice properly first. That's why you should never casually provoke the black-bellied Duke. Mason got bullied hard again. And now his younger sister had finally met Mason too, just because Mason wanted to match Duke and Uriel together. He had even said that if Duke was willing, he would be very happy to help. This time, Duke was truly furious. He wanted to see exactly how Mason intended to help him. Startled by Duke's sudden approach, Mason backed away. "Stay away from me." But Duke carried a chilling pressure about him. "Didn't you say you'd help me? You need to keep your promise." Mason couldn't understand. What does that have to do with this? But before he could finish, he was forced back until there was nowhere left to retreat. How could it have nothing to do with it? Isn't this what you wanted? Isn't this what you want me to do with him? And if I'm too forceful and scare him away, what then? So, you need to help me practice properly, if you want to leave me. Mason immediately sensed something was wrong and snapped at him to get lost. That finally enraged Duke completely. A sudden kiss fell without warning. Mason had never imagined the story would develop like this. At the same time, Shui, who had been diligently acting as Uriel's helper, began reflecting on herself. She knew Uriel had gone on a date, but she had no idea how it ended. She felt she had really gone too far. The entire game's setting was right before her eyes. Yet instead of going to see it in person, she spent every day here being a maid. Then she got a brilliant idea and thought of something useful. She decided to use delivering an umbrella as an excuse to go to the school and see for herself. Meanwhile, Mason was still depressed over what Duke had done when suddenly a hand landed on his shoulder. His reflexes instantly kicked in, and he slapped the person's hand away in alarm. It turned out to be Uriel, who had come to tell him that their next class would be in another classroom. Hearing that, Mason apologized and said he'd go right away. But Uriel could clearly see that Mason's entire body was still trembling. So when Mason stood up, Uriel grabbed him, wanted to talk to him. But in one misstep, the two of them stumbled and fell together. And just then, Shui happened to be standing at the classroom door. She witnessed the ambiguous scene with her own eyes. Before either of them could react, Shui rushed over in a single bound and kicked Mason again. She hadn't recognized at all that the person in front of her was actually her own older brother. To her, he was just that notorious son of the Knox family from a game. She thought Uriel was being harassed, and so Mason was kicked unconscious by his own sister again. Uriel quickly explained that he had tripped by himself, and that Mason wasn't the kind of person the rumors made him out to be. After Mason was sent to the infirmary, he slept unconscious for quite a while before slowly waking up. During that time, Uriel and Shui had stayed by his side. For that moment, he really thought he was going to die. He hadn't felt such terrifying pain in a very long time. Uriel apologized, saying it was his maid's misunderstanding, and said he would provide whatever compensation Mason wanted. Mason felt there was no need. He thought the maid had only acted to protect him, and as long as she was given a small warning, that would be enough. Unsurprisingly, he still didn't recognize that the maid in front of him was actually his younger sister. But Shui found it a little unbelievable. Under normal circumstances, she felt Mason should have used this matter to threaten Lady Uriel. And yet Uriel was even saying he was a good person. She felt Mason was probably just trying to win Uriel's favor, so he could do something even worse. She felt she had to keep an eye on Mason and expose his truly ugly side. And so, next, his good little sister began secretly stalking her own good older brother. Here it came. The possessive crown prince was jealous again. In order to expose Mason's true colors, his little sister Shui secretly lurked around Mason's side. Yet after observing him for a full round, Mason showed not the slightest suspicious behavior. In fact, everything he did was completely unlike the character in the game as she knew him. And for some reason, he even gave her a strange sense of familiarity. At the same time, by the garden, a few little punks who had always disliked Mason were talking about him, because he had both His Highness the Crown Prince and the black-bellied Duke backing him. The few of them were grinding their teeth in rage. Shui had wanted to move closer and hear what they were saying about Mason, but she wasn't careful with her footing and made a noise. The boys noticed a movement over there and shouted, "Who's there?" The frightened Shui bolted like a startled kitten, but one of the male students spotted her and started walking toward her. Just as she was about to be discovered, a soccer ball came flying straight toward her head. Mason walked over apologetically to retrieve the ball. The moment they saw it was Mason, the boys quickly dragged their companion away. After all, they were afraid of the people behind him. Mason casually said, "That guy's got a foul mouth." "I agree," came the reply. The brother and sister spoke in perfect sync, then looked at each other. Shui hurriedly wanted to explain, but in truth Mason had known from early on that she was tailing him. Hearing what Mason said, Shui stopped pretending and warned him to stay away from Uriel and stop plotting anything against him. Mason awkwardly said that he had only come looking for the ball and wasn't interested in Uriel at all. Hearing that, Shui was completely dumbfounded. She couldn't figure out what exactly was going on. Had something gone wrong? Or had the game bugged out? Mason froze. He had heard Shuei's words clearly. He finally understood what that terrifying yet familiar pain was about. The person in front of him really was his younger sister, Gina. During their conversation, Shui also came to understand that Mason had been kicked into this game by her and had been living here all this time in the identity of the notorious Mason. At the same time, Shui told Mason why she herself had ended up here too. After she kicked him that day, all the game's save data was gone, and she got furious and wanted to take it all out on him. But then she realized he wasn't moving at all, and she panicked. In her panic, she thought the most important thing was to call the tech support company first and then an ambulance second. But when she went to grab the phone on the desk, she slipped, crashed straight into the computer, and when she opened her eyes again, she was lying in a strange forest. Snow was falling from the sky. Later, Uriel saved her. She realized she had transmigrated into the game, but regarding her current character, all she remembered was that the name was Shui. After that, she used her knowledge of the game to become Uriel's personal maid. Hearing this, Mason felt awful. He had thought he must have died like an idiot in the real world. If their parents suddenly lost 2 children at once, how heartbroken would they be? Until Shui told him that they weren't dead. At first, she had thought Mason had died too. But later, after thinking carefully, she was certain that in the real world, Mason had still been breathing. And she suspected that the flow of time here and in the real world had to be different. Their souls existed here, while in reality, they were probably only in a comatose state. Because of that, Mason felt that there was a good chance they could still return to the real world. So he asked Shui whether there was any way back. Shui rolled her eyes at him. Why would I want to go back? Why would I give up the chance to witness a happy ending in person? Mason exploded in anger. The ending you want might get me killed. Maybe my body in the real world is still alive, but who knows? If I get killed in the game, will I die in the real world too? And are you sure that with nothing but the identity of a maid, you'll be able to deal with everything that's about to happen in this world? Hearing Mason say that, Shui finally gave up her own idea. But even she didn't know how to get back to the real world. Mason told her that before, he had found mention in a children's book of a history of fate. He had tried looking for it, but never managed to find it. Shui thought about it. There really hadn't been any mention of such a book in the game. She wanted to take a look, but when she heard Mason say it was in the palace, Shui immediately lost her composure. She hadn't even met the crown prince yet. This wasn't fair. Just then, Carl's voice rang out. She recognized that voice. The person before her was none other than the Carl she had been longing to see. She was so excited she practically felt like she might spray a nosebleed everywhere, and quickly dropped her knees to bow, blushing furiously. She introduced herself as Uriel's maid and said she had just had a small misunderstanding with Mason. Hearing this, Carl's gaze paused. What kind of misunderstanding would make a servant grab a noble by the collar? Depending on the situation, perhaps, but it certainly wasn't a small matter. Shui wanted to explain that Mason had forced. Before she could finish, Mason quickly cut her off and hastily made up an excuse. At the same time, he shot Shui a warning look. If I die here, your fun is over too. So when I say something, you'd better nod. Shui promptly cooperated and nodded. Carl saw that scene of perfect tacit understanding between the two of them clearly. Mason, you always have so many friends. As he said this, he strode toward Mason and then pulled him into his arms. Mason, I just so happen to be your friend too. But without me, you always seem so happy. That's not fair. Things are getting bad. Mason seemed to be wavering toward the black-bellied Duke, and at the same time Crown Prince Carl had also found out that Mason had gone out on a date with Duke. He had already started secretly investigating Duke behind the scenes. He swore that he would never again let anyone take any of his things from him. And now he had run into Shui and Mason pulling at each other, while the two of them even seemed strangely in sync. Carl was jealous. Clearly, he was Mason's friend too, but whenever Mason was happy, he was never there. It wasn't fair. And Rosie told me that last week, you even went out with Lady Uriel. Mason explained that it had just been a chance encounter. They had never arranged to go out together. Carl's expression darkened. Then did you also just happen to run into Duke? Mason was visibly stunned. Shuei was even more confused. Wasn't it supposed to be Uriel and the prince going on a date? Why had it become Rosie and Mason together? And why was Carl saying he was jealous? He and her brother seemed very close, to the point that it almost looked as if something had happened between them. It wasn't until Mason promised Carl that next time he would definitely make time for him that Carl finally let it go. Just then, the class bell rang, and Mason pushed Carl away, urging him to leave quickly. As he walked off, Mason kept glancing back and gesturing to Shuei, telling her she had better find a way back to the real world, or else he was dead for sure. Shuei was completely bewildered and had no idea what was going on, but after understanding Mason's gesture, she silently signed back. Okay. That night, Mason returned to the dorm exhausted in body and mind. So many strange things had been happening lately, but at least Gina was here, so he was no longer fighting alone, and she had said they weren't dead. Maybe they really could return to the real world. After taking off his clothes, the bite marks Duke had left on him stood out clearly. So the person from the freshman party really had been Duke. The places that Hand had touched were still just as cold, and he still carried that same cool scent. Even the feeling had been the same, far too good. He suddenly broke down in frustration. He couldn't believe he actually thought it had felt good. He felt like he had gone crazy. He kept telling himself it had to be because he had been drunk that night, thinking that he would be leaving this world soon anyway. He tried persuading himself to dig those thoughts out of his head. But then why had Crown Prince Carl also said that after the freshman party, he had followed him back to his room? Mason was confused again. Meanwhile, Carl was secretly investigating Duke, but in the end, for some unknown reason, there was no way to find any record of him or his family. The more he thought about what had happened that night, the deeper his hatred for Duke became. How dare that guy take what belonged to him? It turned out that on the night of the freshman party, Carl had heard Uriel say that someone was bullying Mason, so he had chased after him, but he didn't find Mason. Instead, he ran into those little punks who were always bullying them. From their words, all he heard was regret. If that guy hadn't interfered, we would have had our way with Mason tonight. After hearing that loud and clear, Carl beat them viciously and warned them to watch themselves if they still wanted to remain in the academy. In the end, he learned from them that it was Duke who had taken Mason away, so he hurried to Mason's room. Only when he saw the person on the bed did he breathe a sigh of relief. But when he walked closer, he finally saw the hickeys on Mason's neck. Enraged, Carl yanked the blanket away. Everywhere visible to the naked eye was covered in marks. All of it was done by that bastard Duke. Carl ground his teeth so hard they creaked. Deep under Mason's wrist, he left a mark of his own. He swore that this time, he would never let anyone take anything of his away again. What he didn't know, though, was that on the day Mason and Duke went out together, Mason had been eaten up by Duke all over again. Great. Now even the third male lead, the wolf pup, had arrived, and he had also caught someone else's scent on Mason. Several of them were gathered together in the library. Carl carefully tutored Mason in his studies, but Mason couldn't take in a single word right now. He was only doing this to kill some time. Uriel and Carl, meanwhile, each had their own thoughts. One thought that everyone studying together made it easier to concentrate, and the other said that teaching someone else was also a way of learning. But really, both of them just wanted a chance to spend time with Mason and Rosie. During this, Uriel eagerly asked whether there would be a party after finals. Rosie said that every term ended with such a party and that students from every grade attended together. Rosie himself was clearly looking forward to this party too. Mason, however, only wanted to go home. The brother and sister squatted in a corner to discuss ways of getting home. In order not to arouse suspicion, Shuei had even specially gotten hold of a map to make investigating easier. But no matter what, she couldn't find any information about the history of fate, so she thought of some other methods that might let them return to the real world. She thought they might as well let the original game continue all the way to the story's ending. Once the game ended, perhaps they would be able to go back. Mason exploded again. How many times had he said it already? If things followed the original plot, he was definitely going to die. But Shuei said, not necessarily. Mason's ending had been fixed because originally he was just a small character in the game. He was the one who turned Rosie bad, but the real key figures were the male leads, the heroine, and the female villain. As long as they stayed true to their roles, everything would work out. Besides, ever since Mason had transmigrated in, he was no longer that notorious vicious young master. That was why she had proposed this method. But more importantly right now was what would happen at the end of term party. That was the key event in the whole game. On that day, Carl would write Uriel a letter asking him to meet in the Academy's back garden during the banquet. That was when their relationship truly began to blossom. But after hearing about it, Rosie would also go to the garden, and after witnessing everything with his own eyes, he would completely blacken. As long as they stayed true to their roles, the game would continue along the original script. But Mason knew that according to the game's setting, Rosie was bound to be executed in the end. He didn't want to see Rosie meet that kind of ending. Shui tried to comfort Mason, saying that since he had already known Rosie for a while, he still couldn't interfere in their story. This was their fate, so that night, he must do nothing. Mason left without saying a word. Even though he himself was only inside a game, he still couldn't stand by and watch a tragedy happen. He would get rid of the letter that triggered the whole thing. But first, he needed to find out exactly how that letter would be delivered. Just as he was thinking about it, he suddenly ran headfirst into Cedric. Cedric glanced at him. Then suddenly his eyes fixed on Mason, and he started sniffing him all over. What was going on? Where was that smell coming from? Why did Mason carry Shuei's scent? But wasn't Shuei supposed to be dead? Mason called to him several times before Cedric finally snapped back to himself and explained that he had smelled a familiar scent on him. Mason sniffed at himself too, but didn't smell anything. Then the next second, he realized something. Could it be because of Gina? Come to think of it, they had the same hair color, and she smelled nice too. Maybe Cedric had recognized his race by scent. Originally, Mason had been considering whether to tell Gina which character he had transmigrated into. But then he thought about how, the moment his little sister saw the male lead she'd always adored, she'd definitely start drooling all over the place. He absolutely could not let them meet. Sure enough, he was worried Mason really would do something. Shay had even followed his scent all the way here because of that so-called blood plague. As expected of a real little sister, the moment she arrived, she directly gave her two dear brothers an assist to keep Shay from running into Cedric. Just as Cedric was about to head in the direction Shay had come from, Mason anxiously grabbed hold of him. If they went that way, they would definitely run into Shay. He really didn't want to see his little sister acting so hopelessly love-struck. Then he heard Cedric say that he actually wasn't very familiar with the school and wanted to look around. Mason suddenly had an idea and said he happened to be a great tour guide. As he spoke, he pulled Cedric in the opposite direction. Mason himself didn't think much of it, but he had no idea that behind him, Cedric was blushing at the sight of the hand tightly holding his. Meanwhile, based on what he knew about Mason from the real world, Shay believed Mason was very likely to do something that would change the entire development of the game. So he had to find Mason. And over here, Mason was introducing the academy buildings to Cedric one by one. But Shay's figure had already appeared not far away. Left with no choice, Mason could only drag Cedric along in a frantic escape while continuing to explain things to him. And Shay, following the scent, chased after them like crazy until Mason was so exhausted he simply couldn't run anymore. He really couldn't understand why Shay always managed to show up around him, while Cedric didn't notice a thing. Cedric even thanked Mason for helping him. If it had been just him alone, in such a huge place, who knew how long it would have taken? Wandering around with Mason also reminded him of the leisurely times he had spent in the forest with his younger brother and sister. He was very happy. Hearing that, Mason started to feel guilty. Maybe he really should find some time to talk to Shay and let them. Just as he was thinking that, Shay was already standing at the doorway, not far away. Before Cedric noticed, Mason rushed over and quickly shut the door. But at this point, it was already too late to run. In desperation, he had no choice but to pull Cedric into a nearby cabinet. When Shay opened the door and came in, he saw no one, so he walked straight to the cabinet. He knew Mason had to be inside. Just as he reached out to open it, Uriel, who was approaching with Rosie from outside, uncertainly called his name. Once he confirmed it really was Shay, Uriel happily grabbed him and praised how good he looked in those clothes, saying he'd almost mistaken him for a student here. Then he started saying he would take him on a proper tour of the academy. At that moment, the cabinet was filled entirely with Mason's scent. Cedric's reason was becoming a little difficult to control. In the cramped cabinet, a noise still slipped out. Rosie, who hadn't gone far yet, heard the movement. The sound had clearly come from the cabinet. Without hesitation, she opened it. The moment it opened, Mason fell out of the cabinet unexpectedly, while Cedric behind him was still crouched facing inside. But one thing was obvious. Their ears were both bright red. Here it comes, here it comes. The childhood sweetheart crown prince, His Highness Carl, was finally making his move. Soon, it was the day of a year-end party. According to the original game setting, Carl would write a letter to Uriel. A secret meeting in the garden would lay the foundation for the start of their relationship. At the same time, Rosie, who witnessed everything, would completely blacken as well. At the party, Rosie first asked Uriel with concern how the exams had gone. Uriel was a little embarrassed and said that thanks to Rosie's help, they hadn't been difficult at all. As the music began to play, the whole party grew lively. Uriel warmly invited Rosie to dance with him. At first, Rosie was happy to accept the invitation. But when the clock struck 9, the time had come. Filled with joy, Rosie said she had to go see someone right now and turned Uriel down. Left behind, Uriel felt as though something in his heart had split open. The only thing he had ever been able to do was stand where he was and wait for someone to look back at him. Meanwhile, Mason was full of worry because he still hadn't found that letter. With no other choice, he went to the place Gina had told him about, trying to find some other way to stop the tragedy from happening. But unexpectedly, Carl was already there in the distance. And after seeing Mason, he even said, "I didn't think you'd really come. I'm glad you're here. I've been waiting for me, not Uriel." Mason was stunned. Carl slowly explained that 5 years ago, they had also met before a ball. Ever since he bumped into Mason dressed as a girl, he had never stopped thinking about that girl who had suddenly appeared and then vanished. And when he and Rosie entered the palace together, he recognized Mason immediately. Watching Mason try so hard to hide his identity was simply too adorable. That was why he had always tried to tease Mason. Only Mason had never known any of this. So he didn't want to lose Mason to anyone. To him, Mason was someone special. People always tried to please him because all they cared about was his title. But Mason let him see his true self. He never cared about his title or anything like that. That was why every time he was with Mason, he felt at ease. And though Mason always acted carefree and thoughtless, in reality, he cared deeply about others. He also knew that whenever Mason had something to say, he never beat around the bush. "So, Mason, I like everything about you." Mason let out a helpless grunt. "What kind of joke was this? I've always only thought of you as my best friend, Your Highness." But before his words had even finished falling, Carl pulled him over in one swift motion. Before Mason could even react, a kiss landed on him. "Don't think you can get rid of me this way again. I'll show you again and again. I won't hide my feelings for you anymore." At the same time, a figure in the distance witnessed everything. It was Rosie. So Carl had, in fact, written an invitation letter just like in the game, but he had arranged for it to be delivered to Mason. However, after the servant received the letter, it somehow ended up tucked inside Rosie's notebook. That was why, when Rosie heard the 9 o'clock chime, she rejected Uriel and chose to come here. She just never imagined she would see something like this. Here it comes, here it comes. The heroine Uriel actually took the initiative to kiss the villainess, and Rosie didn't even reject him. At a corner of the academy, Cedric was instructing his men to stay on high alert. Dealers might try to circulate illegal substances during the gathering. As he was speaking, he heard muttering not far away. It turned out to be Shay, who hadn't been able to find Mason. And because he was worried Mason might do something that would harm the game's original plot, he was about to go crazy. He decided to personally stand guard. Hearing the sound, Cedric had already appeared behind him and pressed a sword to his neck, sternly demanding to know what he was doing there. Servants should all be in the work areas right now. He ordered him to turn around slowly. Shay trembled and explained that he hadn't done anything suspicious as he slowly turned around. Until his whole face was revealed in the moonlight, Cedric could hardly believe it. Even the hand holding the sword was shaking. Meanwhile, back at the party, several people gathered around Uriel and asked with concern why he wasn't with Rosie. When they heard Uriel say Rosie had left to go see someone, the girls became excited at once. Prince Carl isn't here either. Maybe they've gone on a secret date. Hearing the two girls talk about how well Rosie and Carl matched, Uriel felt a surge of unwillingness and displeasure rise in his heart. After giving the two girls a brief greeting, he wandered around the academy alone, feeling an indescribable bitterness inside. Suddenly, he stopped. stopped. He recognized that scent. It was Rosie's scent. Then he saw Rosie lifting her skirt and hurrying over from the garden. Not understanding what was going on, he quickly stepped forward and grabbed Rosie, who was still running. Only then did he see that Rosie's cheeks were covered in tears. What happened? Why are you crying? Angry. Rosie wanted to drive Uriel away. Don't bother me. I want to be alone. Uriel explained that he hadn't meant to disturb her, but he was truly worried about her. All at once, all of Rosie's grievance and anger spilled out. She said that actually, she knew Prince Carl didn't love her, and she also knew that maybe this would never happen. But she had tried to understand him, because she thought that as long as she became Prince Carl's wife, he would eventually love her. Even if he might have feelings for Mason, she believed she could still win Carl's heart because her love for Carl was real. Ever since the day she met Prince Carl as a child, she had fallen in love with him. She had done everything she could to become someone worthy of him. But no matter how hard she tried, Carl was only kind to her out of politeness. Then one day, she saw Prince Carl smile in the way she had always wanted him to smile at her. But he was talking to Mason, not her. I kept trying to deny it, but why did things turn out like this? Hearing this, the bitterness in Uriel's heart deepened. He no longer wanted to hide his feelings for Rosie. I know how you feel, because you're the only one I want. Every time he's by your side, you smile so happily. And every time, all I can do is watch from far away. Sometimes I think, if I were a man, would I have a chance? So I kept waiting for the day you would look back. But now I don't want to wait anymore. I'm tired of waiting. Rosie's mind became even more confused. She couldn't understand at all what Uriel was saying. While she still looked lost, Uriel's kiss had already fallen on her lips. Oh no, Mason had fallen into a massive six-person love chaos battlefield. What should he do now? At that moment, Mason angrily shoved Carl away. He felt Carl never should have done that. He was a straight man, and besides, Carl was clearly engaged to Rosie. Hearing that, Carl excitedly explained that he and Rosie even more unable to accept it. He felt sorry for everything Rosie had done for Carl. He couldn't stand Carl treating Rosie's feelings like that. But since Carl was the crown prince, Mason could only bottle up his anger himself. Throwing down a line that he wasn't interested in him, Mason decided the best strategy was to make a quick escape. Meanwhile, over here, Cedric was frozen in disbelief after seeing his own younger sister again, while Shay, having finally seen the male lead he'd been longing for, had once again gone full fangirl. Only when his eyes caught sight of the sword in Cedric's hand did he suddenly remember what he had come to do. The most important thing right now was making sure Uriel and Carl ended up together. So he absolutely could not get caught here. And just like that, the two siblings who were both trying to escape crashed into each other. The moment Shay saw who it was, he instinctively threw himself at Mason and clung to him, shouting for help. When Carl caught up and saw the two of them embracing again, he no longer believed Shay was just some woman. Mason, who exactly is he? Just as Mason was getting irritated that he couldn't shake off Carl no matter what, Cedric came running toward them, calling Shay's name. Carl kept pressing closer from behind. After all, the last time he had seen these two siblings together, it had looked extremely suspicious. So what exactly was the relationship between Shay and Mason? Although Cedric was somewhat confused and didn't know what Shay's relationship with Mason was, he still took the initiative to step in front of the siblings protectively, explaining that Shay was not a suspicious person. Though his behavior looked suspicious, Cedric could vouch for him. The two siblings each had their own thoughts, listening in total bewilderment. On the other side, Rosie blushed furiously and turned her head away, unable to understand what Uriel had meant by that. Before Uriel could say anything, Mason's voice came from not far away. Carl, emotionally agitated, demanded that Mason give him an explanation. Who exactly was Shay? While Cedric blocked Carl from advancing, he urged Shay to hurry, and at that moment, Uriel and Rosie also arrived after hearing the commotion. Shay got up excitedly, not bothering to help clear things up for Mason, and instead threw himself into Uriel's arms, asking for comfort. Rosie, meanwhile, looked completely calm and asked Mason why they were all here. But the moment she finished speaking, Carl emotionally demanded again whether Mason had really fallen for that female slave and whether he had been toying with his feelings. This was basically Carl confessing in front of everyone that he liked Mason. The situation was already chaotic enough. Mason was so furious his face was almost twisting. He kept saying it wasn't what Carl thought, but that explanation only made things even more impossible to explain. Rosie crouched beside him and asked what was going on. Had he been involved with that maid too, while also toying with his highness's heart at the same time? Mason closed his eyes. He wanted to die. Somebody save me. It's over. Mason had been kidnapped by the second prince again, and this guy even felt that, since he had finally gotten a new toy, it would be a waste not to play with it until it broke. At the bell tower, Jude first asked Mason if he'd been doing okay lately. After all, he really had been suffering one disaster after another recently. Then Jude smiled gently and said he was truly sorry about this. After all, being locked in prison should have been miserable enough. And now, not long after getting out, he was going to be locked up again. His words stopped abruptly. Two people suddenly appeared behind him. Mason knew those two all too well. Weren't they the real culprits behind the monster trafficking from before? He sprang up, trying to resist, but Jude advised him to obediently go with them. Otherwise, the one getting hurt would only be himself. Just like that, Mason was forcibly taken to the East Tower attic. However, the tools inlaid with expensive magic stones had no effect on Mason at all. At that moment, Ian appeared before him. Only then did Mason realize everything had been Ian's doing. Seeing his confusion, Jude took the initiative to explain. The Crown Prince had helped their brothers quite a bit before. So the older brother Ian once mentioned, the one who had helped hide his identity, had actually been him. Ian picked up the handcuffs from before. So it turns out your magic hasn't failed to manifest. Your power is nullification. No wonder Duke no longer needs mother suppressant. Since I already know your secret, I'll tell you a secret even my brother doesn't know. It turned out that he had used cognitive interference simulation on the bell tower. Now this clock tower had become like air that no one could notice. Even if it stood right in the middle of the academy, no one would discover it. Jude smugly chimed in, saying that every time he met secretly with His Highness here, there had never been a problem. Even if Cedric had a keen nose, he still wouldn't be able to smell the traces of illegal drugs. As long as Ian's power remained, his brother and his subordinates would never find the culprit. Mason was in disbelief. He really could do something like this, not caring in the slightest whether those students lived or died. But Ian was clearly enjoying himself. After all, as long as Mason was in danger, Carl and Duke would suffer, and the more they suffered, the happier he would be. As he said this, his eyes flashed. Right, I just had a great idea. Since I finally got a new toy, if I don't play with it until it breaks, that would be my loss. This was bad. Mason had been imprisoned all alone by the second prince. Duke and Carl were going crazy. Because Mason had missed class for several days in a row, Rosie and Uriel anxiously went to find the second sister. They said they had gone to the dormitory, but the boys there all said he hadn't returned for a long time. Second sister felt this was very strange. No matter how unruly Mason might be, he would never skip classes without reason. She said she would immediately contact elder sister Regina to search the surrounding area. But because strange things had been happening to Mason recently, she stopped Rosie and Uriel from getting involved together in this matter. After Uriel came out of second sister's office, Shay rushed up anxiously and asked about the situation. When he learned that only the knights were searching for Mason and that the professors believed they might be in danger too if they got involved, the seriousness of the situation made Shay frantic. He had clearly warned Mason to be careful that day, so how had he still gone missing? In the days that followed, everyone did everything they could to search for Mason. Shay even made missing person notices and expanded the search through the streets in winter. Now even Duke knew Mason had disappeared. Meanwhile, inside the clock tower, Mason tried to destroy the magic stone in the ceiling to save himself. But because the ceiling was too high, all his efforts were futile. It turned out that day Ian had deliberately infused the magic stone with magic, carrying his own ability. Because Mason's nullification power would interfere with direct cognitive manipulation on him, Ian had thought of another method. He wouldn't use cognitive interference on Mason. He would only use it on the space itself. If no one found this place, naturally no one would discover Mason inside. And that bastard Ian had deliberately placed the magic stone on the ceiling. He wanted to watch Mason fail again and again. Mason was really about to lose his mind. He simply couldn't think of any way to escape the East Tower. At the same time, Carl went to Ian and demanded to know where exactly he had hidden Mason. At first, Ian denied everything and even bit back sarcastically. Brother cares about him so much, I thought maybe you were the one who hid him away, so no one could find him. But when he saw Carl's furious expression, Ian revealed a smug smile. If he's so precious to you, why didn't you cherish him properly? Losing him so easily is really disappointing. Cherish him properly? Keep him by your side so he can't go anywhere. Actually, it wasn't that Carl had never thought of doing that. But Mason had rejected him before, so he chose to respect him. Ian only found it laughable. He told Carl that Mason was somewhere in the academy. Brother, let's make a bet. Show me just how much you dote on him. If you can find him within a week, you win. But if you lose, then you'll never see him again. To rescue the imprisoned Mason, the black-bellied Duke was finally making his move. And from Mason's pocket, Duke's necklace just happened to fall out. Ever since that day his confession was rejected, it had been as though an invisible wall stood between the two of them. Was this finally the rhythm of reconciliation? When Jude went in to deliver food, the floor was covered in broken plate shards. Oh dear, you broke all the plates trying to smash the magic stone on the ceiling? But you still need to eat your food properly. After all, it wouldn't be good if you really starved to death here. Besides, once you finish eating, you can use the plates to hit the ceiling again, right? Mason only felt that if his arms were longer, he wouldn't need to waste so much effort. Suddenly, Jude smiled and asked him, I heard your ability is extraordinary. Is that true? Just as Mason didn't understand what he meant, Jude took out a magic stone. Do you know what this is? Judging from the color, it was definitely one of Ian's magic stones. His Highness uses this as a safeguard for unexpected situations. I used to use this often to cast perception-hindering magic on the bell tower, so I could skip class. But when you first came to the magic tower, I was surprised. I had clearly already cast the spell, yet you were lying there anyway. Mason suddenly had an idea, so his power worked on Ian too. Jude told him that had only been a small amount of magic power, but now, with a magic stone that large, could he still nullify it? When Mason said he planned to give it a try, Jude watched him with an amused smile. Good luck. That way His Highness will find it even more entertaining. Seriously, what kind of lunatics were these? So it had all been for the sake of toying with him. The next day, after class, Jude was preparing to head for the East Gate. Duke hid in a corner and, catching him off guard, launched a sudden attack and pinned him against the wall. Before Jude even knew who it was, he panicked a little. Only when he heard Duke say, You don't need to know who I am. You only need to answer my question. Where is Mason? Did he recognize the voice? Jude smiled faintly and said Duke had the wrong person. He had no idea what he was talking about. So Duke told him, while kindly helping his little head think more clearly, that every clue had a traceable path. It turned out that when Carl and Rosie had discussed dissolving their engagement before, Rosie had mentioned receiving a letter, but that letter had clearly been from Mason. Duke remembered that at the time, it was Jude he had arranged to deliver it. After hearing that, Jude still stubbornly refused to admit it. Just because he had accidentally delivered the wrong letter didn't mean he was the culprit. But Duke had already run out of patience. A night's testimony and the emergency statement about Mason secretly spreading drugs had already made everything clear. At first, Jude had felt lucky, hadn't the hearing officials said witnesses would be protected? But Carl had already removed all the professors who worked for Ian through the hearing. Following the trail, they had traced it to Jude. So next, are you really still going to risk your life to hold on to hope in front of your master? Meanwhile, in the clock tower, Mason was still trying to deal with the magic stone on the ceiling, but it was all in vain. Outside the door, the scarred man couldn't take it anymore and warned him that if he didn't stop, he'd be dead soon enough. He was practically being driven mad by the noise of plates smashing. Mason's mentality was on the verge of collapse too. Every time he got kidnapped, he had to suffer. He never wanted to go through a third time. Suddenly, a necklace slipped, rustling from his pocket. Wasn't this the necklace Duke had dropped that day? Here it comes. Here it comes. Mason finally managed to save himself, and he even let the entire main cast searching for him know where he was. But the bad news was that Ian was already holding a dagger pointed straight at him. What he wanted was for them to witness this final scene. Mason picked up the necklace from the ground and saw that it really was the one Duke had dropped before. Originally, he had been planning to find a chance to return it to Duke, so he had kept it in his pocket all this time. Suddenly, he remembered that Duke had once told him that in every generation of their family, there would be one person with a special power, and that strong magic could devour. Mason lifted his head and looked at the magic stone above him. If Duke's magic was powerful enough to swallow up even himself, then maybe this was a chance. So Mason used all his strength and hurled the necklace at the magic stone above. The moment the necklace struck the magic stone, a massive wave of magic burst out from around the clock tower and spread in all directions. That huge surge of magic drew everyone's attention. Duke was more familiar with his own magic than anyone. He no longer had time to care about Jude in front of him and dropped the knife in his hand. Without a single pause, he sprinted madly toward the direction the magic had erupted from. Jude also had no idea what had gone wrong, but he decided to take the chance to run. At the same time, because of the panic, students all over the academy poured out of the dormitories. Cedric led the night order in evacuating and calming them, but things still couldn't be brought under control until Crown Prince Carl stepped in, arranged for the knights to establish magical barriers around the dorms, and promised the cause would soon be investigated. Only then did the chaotic situation begin to settle. After ordering all the knights to patrol the dormitory area in pairs to protect the students' safety, he rushed towards Cedric and had him accompany him to inspect the source of the magical explosion. Cedric asked in surprise whether Carl thought the fluctuation in magic was related to Mason. In truth, Carl wasn't sure either, but the familiar feeling within that magic, it belonged to his younger brother Ian. He didn't say that part to Cedric, but he had a deeply ominous feeling. They had to hurry there. At the same time, before Mason could recover from his shock and escape the clock tower, Ian came in with his two thug lackeys. Especially when he saw his magic stone shattered all over the floor, he wasn't angry at all. Instead, he found it even more amusing. Mason shouted at him that the magic stone was useless now anyway, so he should let him leave. Ian gestured to the thug behind him. That won't do. The man handed him a dagger. Ian then approached Mason with a playful expression. We finally reached the final act. The most interesting scene can't be missing the star. At that moment, Carl and Cedric finally reached the bottom of the East Tower. Carl was certain the magic had erupted from here. Suddenly, hurried footsteps came from behind. It turned out that Rosie, Uriel, and Mason's younger sister had come as well. The whole group had gathered. Now, it was a matter of who would save Mason first. This was bad for the sake of tormenting Carl. Mason was suffering endless abuse at the hands of the second prince, Ian. Carl was in such pain, he cried his heart out. All this time, Carl had always been toyed with by Ian like this. So in the end, Mason decided to drag Ian down with him. Cedric and Carl had just hurried to the foot of the clock tower, followed closely by Rosie, Uriel, and Mason's younger sister Shay. Cedric stepped forward and asked Shay why he had come. Shay obviously couldn't say it was because he was worried, so he made up some random excuse about allergies. Carl, meanwhile, urged Uriel and the others to leave quickly because it was too dangerous here, but Uriel was too worried to calm down and refused. Just then, Ian's loud voice came from above. When they looked up, they saw Mason pinned by Ian's dagger. I'm getting impatient. Why does Big Brother always like showing up late? Instantly, Cedric and Carl were frantic with anxiety. Carl clenched his fists so hard he was grinding his teeth in hatred. He told Cedric to stay here. At first, Cedric was unwilling, but in the end, Carl knew Ian best. He had to go up there himself, while Cedric stayed behind to protect the ladies in case something happened. Before leaving, he looked back once more at Shay in the distance. Although he still had doubts about Shay's relationship with Mason, the most important thing now was rescuing Mason. Carl reached the top of the tower. He knew all of this was just one of Ian's schemes to toy with him. He hoped Ian would let Mason go, but Ian only smiled. Brother is very smart, but being so smart, how did you not think of this? Then the dagger plunged deeply into Mason's body. He wanted to torment Mason precisely so Carl would suffer even more. Carl anxiously tried to step forward, but Ian licked the blood from Mason's body in a twisted display and warned that if Carl dared come one step closer, Mason would die. The pain in Mason's body felt as if it had been stabbed into Carl himself. Then stab me instead. Torture me or kill me. Do whatever you want. But Ian only found that boring. In the air, what spread was Mason's painful screams, one after another. Watching this, Carl was so enraged he nearly bit his own teeth apart. Please stop, Ian. He had truly gone mad. But to Ian, this helpless version of Carl was the most entertaining thing he had ever seen. A deep sense of powerlessness filled Mason. He couldn't remember how many times he had been stabbed. Everything before his eyes seemed to grow increasingly blurred. In that haze, he seemed to see Carl. He remembered that time at the ball when Carl had pulled him close and said Mason was one of his people, that he was someone special he didn't want to lose to anyone else. He also remembered Carl once saying that everyone catered to him only because of his status. But Mason had never treated him according to his identity. That was why staying by Mason's side had always made him feel comfortable. Mason knew Carl had always had it hard. He had been tormented by this lunatic while also having to protect his position as crown prince. He had gone through countless situations like this all by himself. Ian gave a playful smile. "Brother really is the best toy." Mason coldly asked, "Have you always tortured Carl like this?" Ian grew impatient. "You're about to die anyway, so why ask?" Mason let out a cold laugh. "Yeah, I'm about to die, so there's nothing left to be afraid of. You know what kind of person is the most dangerous? Someone who fears nothing." With that, Mason slammed backward with all his strength, dragging Ian with him. In front of Carl, Mason and Ian fell from the tower together. Carl rushed forward in panic. This was bad. Mason was gravely wounded and on the verge of death. The black-bellied Duke, terrified of losing him, had another magical outburst. At that moment, Mason suddenly remembered the game plot from before he had transmigrated. So after Duke's magic erupted, he would become a monster. Because he had seen Carl cry, Mason chose to perish together with Ian. The people below the tower were all frantic when they saw it. Cedric's eyes tightened. He had said before that no matter what, he would protect Mason. So without hesitation, he rushed forward. Fortunately, at the instant Mason fell, Cedric managed to catch his severely injured body. Shay rushed over anxiously to check on his brother's condition. At this moment, Mason had lost consciousness from blood loss. If this continued, Mason really would die. Uriel comforted them, saying not to worry, he would heal him. But when Uriel used his power, to his shock, it had no effect on Mason at all. Carl hurried out from the tower, and Uriel told him he was trying to heal Mason, but the saint's power wasn't working on him. Only then did Carl reveal that Mason possessed nullification. At that moment, Ian's sacrificial laughter sounded from behind them. Even at death's door, Ian was still smug. Brother is going to lose everything. The look on your face right now is really worth seeing. No one could be bothered with him. They had to hurry and get a doctor. Just then, Duke arrived too. But when he saw Mason covered in blood and flesh like that, those old memories came rushing back. That one time, yes, that one time, he had put Mason in danger. That time, Mason had nearly lost his life right in front of him. No, I can't. I can't lose you again. The magic around Duke burst out uncontrollably once more. Instantly, Mason felt a wave of dizziness crash over him. He forgot what he had been doing. He clearly remembered he had been in his room playing a game. It had almost reached the ending. Uriel had finally reached the bottom of the clock tower with Carl. But then an unidentified monster had appeared in the game, roaring. Only when Uriel heard that roar did he realize it was an evil existence. And now, that monstrous roar was coming from Duke's mouth. In an instant, in order to deal with the monster, the saint's power awakened within Uriel. He urged everyone to get away from Duke immediately. He's not human anymore. God, please hear my call. Deliver us from evil. Then an item appeared in Uriel's hand. In the midst of everyone's shock, Carl recognized at once that what Uriel had summoned was the holy